Hi guys. Tonight we step into a place where the cold arrives before you do. You are standing just outside a log cabin as the last weak light drains out of the winter sky. Snow creaks under your boots with a dry, brittle sound, the kind that tells you the temperature has already crossed into serious territory. Your breath appears immediately, not drifting away, but hanging close to your face, as if unsure whether to leave. Somewhere nearby, wood shifts and settles with a low complaint, a sound that feels older than language. You probably will not survive this comfortably. That is the quiet truth people learned early on out here. Survival was not heroic, it was procedural. It was a series of small decisions, made correctly, again and again, while tired and cold and trying not to waste anything. And tonight you are about to learn how families endured the coldest nights in log cabins that were never meant to be warm in the modern sense. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, tell me where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. There is something fitting about knowing how far this quiet night stretches. Now dim the lights and let yourself step fully into the cabin. You push the door closed behind you and the outside cold does not disappear. It simply changes shape. Inside, the air is still sharp cleaner, somehow stripped of softness. A mainstream historical fact that shows up again and again in frontier records is that log cabins were rarely heated continuously through the night. Firewood took time and muscle to gather, and both were limited. People expected the temperature indoors to fall steadily after sunset. Warmth was something you borrowed, not something you owned. The room is smaller than you imagined. That is intentional. Smaller spaces lose heat more slowly. Your shoulder almost brushes the wall when you turn, and your fingertips catch on the uneven texture of logs chinked with dried mud and straw. Even well-built cabins leaked air. No one pretended otherwise. The goal was not comfort, it was delay. You pause and listen. The cabin has its own soundscape, a faint ticking from contracting wood, a whisper where wind finds a seam and explores it patiently. Early settlers learned these sounds the way sailors learned waves. Ordinary noises were reassuring. Sudden silence could be unsettling. A quirky detail, found in some 19th century diaries, mentions people waking abruptly because the cabin went too quiet, worrying that heavy snow had smothered the airflow around the structure. You move toward the center of the room, where the stove or hearth waits. Even cold, it dominates the space. Iron holds memory. You can smell old ash, a dry mineral scent mixed with faint smoke embedded in the walls and fabrics. Historians still argue whether the introduction of cast iron stoves truly improved nighttime survival or simply shifted how people managed fuel. Some accounts suggest stoves made evenings warmer, but nights colder once the fire died, encouraging people to stay up later and burn more wood than before. You imagine the family who lives here, or lived here, moving through the same motions you are making now. Boots off carefully, not because of etiquette, but because snow melts into water and water steals heat. Wet floors were enemies. One widely accepted observation from frontier life is that moisture was treated with near suspicion. Wool was prized not because it was soft, but because it stayed warm, even when damp. Cotton, though cheaper, quietly fell out of favour in cold regions for nighttime use. You rub your hands together not to warm them yet, but to feel how cold has already changed your body. Fingers stiffen slightly, movements become economical. Out here, people learn to conserve motion, the same way they conserved fuel. Even speech slowed down at night. Words required breath, and breath carried heat away. The door behind you gives a small thump as it settles fully into its frame. That sound marks a boundary. Inside is marginally safer than outside, but not by much. The cold does not stop at walls. It negotiates, it tests, it waits. And you begin to understand why families treated nighttime as a shared project. No one truly went to bed alone, even if they lay down separately. You glance at the bed, or beds piled with uneven layers. Blankets do not match. Some are heavy and coarse, others thin and worn soft by years of use. One fringe anecdote mentioned in a Midwestern homestead letter describes a family ranking blankets by trustworthiness rather than warmth. The oldest, ugliest one was placed on top because it blocked drafts best. You feel the psychological weight of night settling in. Darkness stretches differently here. Without clocks that mattered time loosened, people slept in fragments. Waking was expected, listening was part of rest. There is an open scholarly discussion about whether segmented sleep patterns on the frontier were a cultural carryover from Europe or a direct adaptation to cold and fire management. Either way, lying down did not mean surrendering awareness. You move closer to the hearth again, not lighting it yet. Lighting a fire is a commitment. It means feeding it later or accepting a colder drop when it dies. These calculations happen automatically once you have lived through enough nights. You can almost feel that inherited caution in your own hesitation. Outside, wind shifts. The cabin answers with a low groan. Snow brushes the walls, a dry, rasping sound that reminds you how thin the barrier really is. Yet people survived, night after night, winter after winter. Not because they conquered the cold, but because they learned how to live alongside it without wasting energy, fighting what could not be changed. You finally sit, letting the stillness hold you. The cold has found you, yes, but it has not won. Not yet. And as the night deepens, you begin to see how survival here was less about endurance and more about understanding. You begin to notice how the cabin presses inward, not aggressively, but with intention. The walls are close enough that the room never quite lets you forget them. When you stretch your arms, you can almost touch opposite sides. This is not claustrophobia, this is design. On the frontier space was a liability once winter arrived. A mainstream historical reality, often mentioned without comment in settler records, is that cabins were deliberately built small to reduce the volume of air that needed warming. Every extra cubic foot meant more cold waiting to be managed. You run your palm along the interior wall. The logs are thick, stacked carefully, but never perfectly aligned. Chinking fills the gaps in uneven lines dried into a cracked pale paste. It smells faintly of earth and old straw. Builders worked with what they had, and what they had was rarely ideal. Trees were cut nearby to avoid hauling, which meant logs varied in size and dryness. As they aged, they twisted slightly, opening hairline gaps that no amount of mud could permanently seal. You feel those gaps now, not as wind exactly, but as a sense of movement. Air sneaks rather than rushes. It slides along the floor first, pooling around ankles. People learned quickly that cold did not fall from the ceiling. It crept in low and spread upward. This is why beds were raised even slightly off the ground whenever possible. It is also why children were often placed higher in sleeping arrangements, their smaller bodies protected from the coldest layer of air. There is a quiet ingenuity in the way the cabin is arranged. Corners are rounded with stored items. A sack of grain, here a trunk there. Not clutter, mass. Everything dense helps. One quirky tidbit from a Canadian homestead journal describes a family stacking books and spare tools against the north wall during winter nights to add insulation. The author noted that the cabin felt calmer afterward, as if the wall had been persuaded to stop complaining. You look for windows and find only one small and set high. Glass was expensive and fragile. A larger window meant more light, yes, but also more heat loss. In many cabins, windows were covered at night, with quilts, hides, or even wooden shutters fitted from the inside. There is ongoing academic disagreement about whether light deprivation in winter cabins contributed to seasonal mood changes, or whether such effects were overstated by later observers unfamiliar with pre-electric routines. What is clear is that darkness was accepted as part of thermal management. You step toward the door and examine it closely. It is thick, heavy, and imperfect. The fit is never exact. A rolled cloth or animal skin is wedged along the bottom to block drafts. This simple barrier makes a noticeable difference. Frontier families learned early that stopping airflow mattered more than chasing warmth. Heat that does not escape does not need replacing. You shift your weight and feel the floor respond. Packed earth, or rough planks depending on region and resources. Either way, cold travels easily through it. Rugs are rare luxuries. Instead, people layered whatever they could find. Old coats feed sacks, straw tucked beneath boards. A fringe observation from a Scandinavian immigrant account mentions that some families spread dried moss between floor layers, borrowing a technique remembered from far northern homes. The ceiling hangs low overhead. Smoke stains darken the beams. Heat rises, but not far. The low ceiling keeps warmth within reach. Taller rooms might have looked impressive, but they would have wasted precious degrees near the rafters where no one slept. This practical constraint shaped architecture in ways that modern eyes sometimes misread as primitive. In truth, it was calculated restraint. You realize that the cabin is not a shelter in the way a modern house is a shelter. It is a tool. Every dimension serves a purpose. Even the orientation matters. Many cabins were aligned to minimize exposure to prevailing winds, with the smallest wall facing the harshest direction. Settlers did not always get this right, especially in unfamiliar landscapes. Those mistakes were remembered painfully and corrected when possible. As you stand there, the walls seem to hold the memory of all those nights. They have absorbed breath smoke, whispered conversations and long silences. They have listened to coughing to babies, fussing to wind, testing seams, hour after hour. The structure itself participated in survival. It did not guarantee safety, it simply made survival possible if used correctly. You feel your own movements slowing again. The cabin encourages this. Quick gestures waste heat. Leaning, resting, staying close to the center, all feel instinctive now. You understand why families spent evenings close together. Not because they lacked space elsewhere, but because the cabin worked best when used cooperatively. Outside, the wind presses once more, probing. Inside, the walls answer with dull resistance. Not victory, just enough. And you sense that everything that follows tonight will depend on how well this small wooden box continues to negotiate with the cold on your behalf. Your attention drifts back to the hearth because it always does. Even cold and dark, it dominates the room without asking permission. Fire is not warmth yet, it is potential. A promise that can be fulfilled or squandered depending on what you do next. On the frontier, fire was never background scenery. It was an active participant in every decision after sunset. A widely recognized historical reality is that most families planned their evenings around the fire's lifespan, not the clock. Time was measured in burns, not hours. You crouch beside it and open the small iron door, or brush ash aside if it is an open hearth. Inside, there is nothing but grey residue and a faint mineral smell. No hidden glow, no generosity left over from earlier. Lighting a fire from cold ash requires patience and intention. People learned quickly not to do it impulsively. Once lit, a fire demands attention. It must be fed, watched, negotiated with. Neglect leads to waste. Overfeeding leads to scarcity later. You imagine the familiar ritual. Kindling first, thin pieces that catch quickly, then slightly thicker wood, arranged to encourage airflow without letting heat escape too fast. This choreography mattered. One quirky detail preserved in several settler manuals suggests that experienced families could judge the night's temperature by how the fire sounded as it caught. A sharp crackle meant dry air and deeper cold. A softer hiss suggested moisture and slightly less danger. Firelight changes the room immediately. Shadows shrink, surfaces soften. Your hands warm just enough to remind you how cold they were before. That contrast is almost painful. Many historical accounts mention that rewarming fingers and toes hurt more than the cold itself, producing a prickling ache that required restraint. People learned not to rush this stage. Sudden heat could be as uncomfortable as none at all. The fire becomes the cabin's emotional center. Faces turn toward it, movements orbit it. Even when no one speaks, attention gathers there. Historians still argue whether this constant focus on the hearth reinforced stronger family bonds or simply reflected the practical necessity of shared resources. Either way, isolation was rare at night. Warmth was communal by default. You feel the uneven spread of heat. Knees and shins warm first, then hands. Your back remains cool. Fire does not fill a room evenly. It radiates directionally, creating zones of comfort and neglect. People learned where to sit, where to sleep, and when to rotate positions. Children were often placed closest, early in the evening, then shifted away as sleep deepened, and adults took the warmer spots to act as buffers against drafts. The fire also controls sound. Burning wood snaps and settles. Embers collapse inward with small clicks. These noises were deeply familiar. They reassured people that heat still existed. Silence from the hearth could be unsettling, signalling that warmth was slipping away. A fringe anecdote from a New England diary describes a woman waking repeatedly through the night just to listen for the fire's breathing, as she called it. You add a piece of wood carefully, not too large. Large logs burn longer, but steal heat initially as they warm themselves. This trade-off mattered. Settlers developed strong opinions about optimal log size for overnight burns. Some favoured slow, dense hardwoods. Others preferred softer woods that could be replenished easily. There is ongoing scholarly debate about whether fuel choice significantly altered nighttime survival rates or merely affected comfort and routine. Smoke becomes another consideration. Chimneys were imperfect. Downdrafts could push smoke back into the room, stinging eyes and coating lungs. People learned to read wind direction before lighting the fire. In bad conditions, they accepted less warmth rather than choking air. The smell of smoke clings to everything. Hair blankets walls. It becomes part of the cabin's identity. As the fire settles into a steady rhythm, you feel the room relax slightly. Not warm, manageable. This is the goal. People did not aim to banish cold entirely. That would have required too much fuel. Instead, they sought a narrow band where bodies could function without wasting energy fighting extremes. You sit back and let the fire work while it can. Already you are thinking ahead. How long will this last? How much wood remains? Whether it is worth feeding again later or letting it die and relying on blankets and shared heat instead. These calculations happen quietly, almost unconsciously, shaped by experience rather than arithmetic. Outside, the night deepens. Inside, firelight flickers against log walls, casting moving shadows that feel almost companionable. For now, you have negotiated a temporary truce with the cold. It will not last forever. But it does not need to. It only needs to last long enough to prepare for what comes after. The flames shrink back into ash. Your eyes drift almost against your will toward the woodpile. It sits near the wall, not large, not small, but never quite enough. That feeling was universal. Fuel always seemed to vanish faster at night, as if darkness itself consumed it. One widely accepted observation from frontier accounts is that winter survival hinged less on how much wood you had overall, and more on how quickly you went through it after sunset. Daytime fires could be efficient. Nighttime fires were emotional. They tempted you to burn more than you should. You rise and kneel beside the pile, running your fingers along split edges. The wood is dry, which is good, but dry wood burns faster. Everything is a compromise. You begin to understand why people described winter evenings as quietly tense. No one announced it, no one argued openly, but everyone knew that each log placed on the fire was a small gamble against tomorrow. Families developed unspoken systems. Certain pieces were mentally reserved for morning, others were for emergencies. Children were taught early which logs were not to be touched. This was not discipline for discipline's sake, it was survival accounting. One offbeat detail recorded in a Missouri settler's letter mentions that her children named the largest remaining logs as if that made them harder to burn by accident. You count without counting. Not numbers, but nights. How many more evenings can this pile support before it must be replenished? That calculation never really leaves the mind during winter. It follows you even as you prepare for sleep. Historians continue to debate whether this constant low-level resource anxiety shaped frontier personalities long-term, fostering thrift and restraint, or whether it simply reflected immediate necessity with no lasting psychological imprint. The fire crackles behind you, comfortable for now. You resist the urge to feed it again. This restraint was learned often the hard way. There are records of families who burned too freely, early in the season, and paid for it later with nights spent fully dressed, breath fogging the room, fire reduced to memory. One lesser-known anecdote from the upper Midwest tells of a family dismantling a broken wagon in January to survive a sudden cold snap. Improvisation was not admirable, it was expected. You stand and stretch, feeling warmth cling reluctantly to your joints. Even movement feels costly. People learn to avoid unnecessary trips across the room at night. Every step stirred air. Every stirred air stole heat. Instead, tasks were grouped together. If you stood, you did everything you needed before sitting again. This efficiency shaped habits that felt natural after a while. The woodpile is not just fuel, it is security. Its size affects sleep quality. People slept differently when supplies were plentiful. More deeply, less alert. There is some academic disagreement about whether this translated into measurable health differences, but personal accounts repeatedly mention the comfort of seeing enough wood stacked for several nights. It was a visual reassurance as calming as any blanket. You recall how storms complicated this equation. Snow could bury stored wood. Ice could make splitting dangerous. Wind could steal heat faster than expected, forcing you to burn more than planned. One unusual practice noted in a few northern settlements involved bringing small reserve logs indoors before nightfall, not for immediate use, but to keep them dry and ready. The added mass inside the cabin also helped slow heat loss, a small bonus. The fire shifts again, settling lower. Embers glow dull red. You add a single piece smaller than you want to, larger than you should. This balance becomes instinctive over time. You watch how it catches, how quickly it darkens and begins to glow. This observation teaches you more than any instruction ever could. Outside, wind scrapes along the cabin wall. Snow slides softly from the roof with a hushed sigh. You think briefly of neighbours, if any are near enough to matter. On the frontier, proximity did not guarantee help at night. Travel in darkness and cold was dangerous. People relied first on what was inside their own walls. Cooperation existed, but it respected distance. You return to your place near the fire, lowering yourself carefully. Muscles complain quietly. The day's labour still lingers in your body. Cold does not erase fatigue, it magnifies it. This is another reason fires were not kept roaring all night. Exhaustion made vigilance harder. Better to sleep wake, assess, then act if needed. You realise that the woodpile governs more than warmth. It governs mood. Conversation slows when supplies look thin. Laughter becomes rare, not because joy disappears, but because energy is conserved. Silence becomes practical. A subtle social rule develops around not mentioning the pile too often, as if naming scarcity might hasten it. As the evening settles fully into night, you feel the fire's warmth retreat slightly. The cabin does not protest. It simply adjusts. You tuck your hands closer to your body and accept that the peak has passed. This acceptance is crucial. Fighting it wastes strength. Tomorrow wood will need to be gathered again. Axes lifted, logs split, hands numbed. But tonight all that matters is using what you have wisely. The pile waits, the fire breathes, and you learn without instruction that survival here depends as much on restraint as on action. When you finally turn your attention to the bedding, it is not with relief. It is with strategy. Sleep here is not collapse. It is arrangement. Every layer has a purpose, even if no one ever explains it out loud. You lift the edge of the top blanket and feel its weight settle back down with a muted thump. Heavier than it looks, uneven too. Some areas are dense and stiff, others worn thin and soft from years of use. Uniform comfort was never the goal. Coverage was. You begin layering deliberately. First what touches the body, then what traps air, then what blocks movement. One well-established detail in frontier household accounts is that insulation depended more on still air than thickness alone. Several imperfect layers worked better than one massive covering because they created pockets where warmth could linger instead of escaping all at once. This logic guided everything, from clothing to wall construction, and nowhere did it matter more than at night. You shake one blanket gently, not snapping it just enough to let it settle with air caught inside. The sound is dull and familiar. Settlers learned to listen for that sound. A blanket that fell too flat had lost its usefulness. A quirky tidbit preserved in a Kansas homestead notebook mentions a woman complaining that her favourite quilt had become too obedient lying flat, no matter how she shook it, and was quietly retired to daytime use only. Underneath, you place something rougher. Not for warmth exactly, but for friction. Smooth layers slide against each other, opening gaps. Rough ones stay put. This was learned through cold toes and stiff mornings. People rarely described these lessons as knowledge. They were simply habits that appeared after enough nights went wrong. You notice that the bedding spills over the edges of the sleeping surface and onto the floor. This is intentional. Gaps invite cold. Blankets that reach the ground helped seal the space around the body, reducing drafts. In many cabins, beds were positioned against walls, not for privacy, but because it reduced exposed sides. Sleeping in the center of the room meant surrendering warmth on all fronts. As you settle in, you keep your clothes on. Not everything, but enough. A commonly acknowledged reality of 19th century winter life is that people rarely slept naked or lightly dressed. Night clothing was not about comfort, it was about redundancy. If a blanket slipped or the fire failed, clothing became the last defense. Wool again proves its worth here, scratchy but forgiving. Cotton, by contrast, held moisture and quietly stole heat. Those who could afford better materials learned quickly which fabrics could be trusted after midnight. You tuck fabric around your shoulders and feel the faint irritation of coarse fibers against skin. That sensation fades faster than cold ever would. Softness was a luxury people associated with summer or daylight. At night, effectiveness mattered more. There is ongoing scholarly discussion about whether this constant exposure to mild discomfort reshaped sensory tolerance over time, making later generations less sensitive to roughness and more focused on function. You become aware of how your breathing changes. Slow, controlled. Breathing too deeply wastes warmth. People learn to draw air in gently and let it out without force. This was not conscious most of the time. It emerged naturally, shaped by experience rather than instruction. Children copied adults. Adults adjusted without naming it. Someone else shifts nearby if you are not alone. Bodies reposition carefully, not jostling, not dramatic. This choreography is practiced. Blankets are shared resources. Pulling too much leaves someone else exposed. A fringe anecdote from an Illinois family letter describes a nightly ritual of minor negotiations conducted entirely through small tugs and pauses, no words exchanged until everyone was satisfied enough to sleep. You pull one last covering over your feet. Feet lose heat quickly and signal discomfort loudly. Keeping them warm was a priority. Some families placed hot stones or bricks wrapped in cloth near the feet early in the night, though this practice carried risks if done carelessly. There is debate among historians about how widespread this method truly was, versus how often it appears in later recollections coloured by nostalgia. The weight settles, not oppressive but firm. The blankets press down just enough to limit movement. This stillness helps. Tossing and turning creates gaps. People learn to find a position and commit to it. Sleep became a cooperative act between body and bedding. The room grows quieter as everyone settles. The fire's presence recedes into the background, no longer the centre of attention. Its warmth lingers in the air, and in the blankets a borrowed comfort slowly spent. You do not chase it, you accept the gradual cooling as part of the night's rhythm. Your mind drifts, but not completely. Part of you remains alert, tuned to sensation. Cold teaches awareness. You notice when a draft touches your cheek, and you adjust without waking fully. You sense when a blanket edge loosens, and you tuck it back instinctively. This half-awareness is not anxiety, it is skill. Outside, wind presses again. Inside, layers answer, cloth against cloth, wool against skin, air trapped and held. You realize that blankets were not just objects, they were systems. Systems refined over years of trial and error passed down without ceremony. As your body warms, the small pocket you have created, a fragile equilibrium forms. Not comfort in the modern sense, but stability. Enough to rest, enough to let the night pass without incident. You exhale slowly and let your eyes close, trusting that the careful work you have done will hold until morning, or at least until the next waking. You are aware now that sleep is not solitary here, even if the room is quiet. Bodies are arranged with purpose, not sentiment, not affection in the modern sense, but efficiency. You shift slightly and feel another presence nearby, close enough that warmth overlaps. This is intentional. One well-documented aspect of frontier domestic life is that families often slept in a single room during winter, regardless of how many rooms the structure technically had. Empty space was a liability. Every unoccupied corner was another place for cold to settle and wait. You remember how this arrangement might look from the outside and how wrong that impression would be. It was not crowded, it was calculated. Children placed between adults. Smaller bodies tucked into the safest zones. Larger bodies positioned nearer walls or doors acting as buffers. This pattern appears again and again in personal accounts, described matter-of-factly without embarrassment or explanation. It simply made sense. You feel how heat behaves differently when bodies are close. It does not radiate outward evenly. It gathers. It lingers. A subtle shared warmth develops less intense than fire, but steadier. Fire flares and fades. Body heat is modest but reliable. People trusted it. There is ongoing scholarly disagreement about how much shared sleeping actually raised ambient temperature versus how much it simply reduced individual heat loss, but those who practiced it rarely questioned its value. Someone shifts beside you, a careful movement designed not to break the arrangement. Blankets rise and fall slightly. A child exhales in a soft, rhythmic pattern. Breathing becomes another shared element, slow and measured. Loud breaths waste warmth. Quiet breathing preserves it. This was learned early, not through instruction, but imitation. Children matched the cadence around them without thinking. A lesser-known anecdote from a frontier schoolteacher's journal mentions that she could tell which children came from well-organized winter households because they slept quietly, even away from home, curling instinctively into compact positions and conserving heat. Those from less practiced homes tossed and woke frequently. Habit traveled with the body. You notice how space between people is treated as something to be minimized, but not eliminated. Touch is not constant. Proximity matters more than contact. Arms may brush, shoulders may rest briefly. But the goal is shared warmth, not entanglement. Too much movement disrupts the system. Stillness is cooperation. You reflect on how this would feel to someone accustomed to private rooms and personal space. Strange, perhaps even uncomfortable at first. Yet frontier accounts rarely frame it that way. The discomfort lay elsewhere in cold fingers, stiff joints and the fear of resources running out. Sleeping close solved problems. It did not create them. There is also an emotional layer, though it is understated. Night magnifies vulnerability. Illness, fire, failure, storms, all arrived most often after dark. Being near others reduced risk. If someone stirred, suddenly others would wake. If a child cried, help was immediate. One might argue that this arrangement fostered deeper familial bonds, but some historians suggest it simply reflected necessity rather than affection, with emotional interpretations added later by descendants looking back. You adjust your position slightly, pressing your back more firmly against the warmth behind you. The blanket shifts, but holds. Someone else adjusts in response, a small counter movement that restores balance. This coordination is unconscious now. It has been practiced for months, maybe years. Outside, the wind tests the cabin again. Inside, bodies answer by holding heat more tightly. This collective response feels almost instinctive, like animals huddling against weather. The comparison is not insulting, it is accurate. Humans are social mammals. Frontier winters reminded people of that in very practical ways. You become aware of how shared sleeping reduced fear. Not eliminated it, but softened it. Strange sounds outside mattered less when others were close. Silence felt less ominous. A fringe story from a Dakota Territory settlement recounts how a family once slept through a wolf circling their cabin because the usual panic never took hold. They woke together in the morning and dealt with it, then calm and alert. There were limits, of course. Illness complicated closeness. When someone was sick, arrangements shifted. Distance increased just enough to reduce spread while still sharing warmth. This balancing act appears in letters, and journals rarely dramatized, always practical. People did what they could with what they had. You think briefly about privacy, or the lack of it. It mattered less here. Night was for survival and rest. Privacy returned during daylight in small moments and separate tasks. Expectations adjusted. People rarely complained about things they did not expect to have. As sleep deepens, the sense of individual boundaries softens. You are aware of others without focusing on them. Warmth moves subtly through shared space. The blankets rise and fall with collective breathing. This rhythm becomes the background of your dreams. There is some academic debate about whether such sleeping arrangements contributed to better nighttime heat retention, or whether their main benefit was psychological reassurance. The truth is likely both. Cold affects the mind as much as the body. Knowing you are not alone reduces stress, and reduced stress conserves energy. Energy saved is warmth preserved. You feel your thoughts slow. The careful awareness of earlier fades into a gentle vigilance. You are resting, but ready. This is how people slept here. Not unconscious, not anxious. Balanced somewhere in between. The night stretches on long and dark, but it does not feel endless. Surrounded by others, sharing breath and warmth, you let yourself drift further. The system holds. The cold waits. And for now, that is enough. You notice that no one has undressed completely for the night. Clothing stays on rearranged rather than removed. Sleeves are pulled down over wrists. Socks are doubled or carefully smoothed to avoid bunching. This is not carelessness, it is preparation. A commonly acknowledged reality of frontier winters is that people treated night clothing as part of their insulation system, not as something separate from bedding. What you wore mattered just as much as what you slept under. You feel the fabric against your skin and recognize its character immediately. Wool scratches faintly, a dry insistence that never quite disappears. It is not pleasant, but it is reliable. Cotton would have betrayed you by now, drawing moisture close and bleeding warmth away without complaint. Many families learned this difference the hard way. Letters from the period occasionally mention garments being quietly reassigned to summer use after a single miserable night. You adjust your collar, tucking it inward so no skin is exposed. Exposed skin becomes a problem quickly. Even small gaps invite cold to explore. People learn to think in terms of seams and edges, not just layers. A quirky observation from a frontier tailor's notebook notes that winter night garments were often cut slightly longer than daytime clothes, not for fashion but to reduce draft points when lying down. Buttons matter. Loose closures leak heat. Ties and simple fastenings were favoured for sleep, because they could be adjusted easily in the dark. You feel for a button near your chest, making sure it is secure but not tight. Tight restricts circulation. Restricted circulation leads to cold fingers and toes. This relationship was understood intuitively long before it was ever explained medically. You sense how your body settles differently when clothed. Movement becomes more deliberate. Fabric resists sudden shifts. This resistance is helpful. It discourages restless motion that might displace blankets or open gaps. People learned that stillness conserved warmth better than constant adjustment. Clothing supported that stillness. There is also the matter of readiness. Nights on the frontier were unpredictable. Fires failed, roofs leaked, animals disturbed the perimeter. One widely reported fact from settlement narratives is that families preferred to remain partially dressed so they could respond quickly without exposing skin to extreme cold. Dressing from scratch at midnight could be dangerous. Staying dressed reduced that risk. You imagine being woken suddenly by a sound outside. You could sit up, stand, even step outdoors briefly, if needed, without losing precious heat. Clothing turned the body into a mobile unit rather than something dependent on bedding. This flexibility mattered. Survival favoured those who could adapt quickly. There is some disagreement among scholars about whether people slept in the same clothes they wore during the day or changed into designated night garments. Evidence suggests both occurred depending on resources. In poorer households, clothing did double duty. In others, slightly looser, thicker items were reserved for sleep. Either way, the principle remained the same. Clothing at night was about function, not presentation. You tug a sleeve down again and feel how the wool has stiffened slightly as the air cools. Fabric responds to temperature the way wood does. It contracts, tightens, settles into a new shape. This stiffness shapes how you move. You do not stretch fully. You do not sprawl. You curl slightly inward, protecting core areas instinctively. Children learned these habits early. No lectures were needed. They watched adults. They copied what worked. A lesser-known detail from a school inspector's report in the late 19th century mentions that children from frontier homes often arrived at winter classes overdressed by urban standards, but were better able to tolerate cold classrooms without complaint. Their bodies had learned cooperation with clothing rather than reliance on external heat. You become aware of how smell plays a role here too. Wool carries scent, smoke, body lanolin. These smells are familiar and grounding. They signal continuity. The same garments have been worn night after night, carrying memory as well as warmth. There is an understated comfort in that familiarity, even if the fabric itself is rough. As the night progresses, you will not remove layers. You will adjust within them. A sleeve pushed up briefly, then pulled back down. A collar loosened slightly, then retucked. These micro-adjustments replace the dramatic acts of modern heating. Warmth is managed, not toggled. You think about how this approach shapes the relationship with the body. Sensation is monitored constantly, but calmly. Cold toes prompt action before numbness sets in. Overheating prompts restraint before sweat forms. Sweat is dangerous here. Moisture becomes ice later. People learn to avoid sweating at night, even if it meant tolerating mild chill. This awareness appears repeatedly in first-hand accounts, often without explanation, as if everyone simply understood. There is an ongoing academic conversation about whether such constant bodily monitoring increased stress or sharpened self-awareness in frontier populations. The answer is unclear. What is clear is that people adapted. The habits became automatic. The mind rested even while the body remained attentive. You shift slightly and feel the clothing move with you, not against you. It has softened over time, molded to your shape. New garments were less trusted. Old ones had proven themselves. A fringe anecdote from a Nebraska homestead describes a woman refusing to part with a threadbare wool shirt because it knew her, as she put it, better than any new one ever could. The fire's warmth has faded now, but your clothing holds what remains. You feel it most at the core, less at the edges. That is acceptable. Core warmth matters most. Fingers and toes can be managed. The body prioritizes without instruction. As your breathing slows, you sense the system working. Clothing, blankets, bodies, walls, all contributing, none sufficient alone. Together they create a narrow band where sleep is possible. Not luxurious, not effortless, but steady. You let your muscles relax within their layered constraints. The scratch of wool fades from awareness. The weight becomes reassuring. You are dressed for the night, not because you plan to go anywhere, but because staying alive here means always being ready. And as the cold continues its patient work outside the cabin, you drift deeper into rest, supported by fabric chosen not for comfort, but for trust. You lie still long enough that the cabin begins to speak. Not loudly, not urgently. It communicates in small adjustments, subtle noises that only exist when everything else has gone quiet. A beam tightens somewhere overhead, producing a low, dry pop. Not sharp enough to alarm, not soft enough to ignore. Wood responds to cold the way skin does, contracting, settling, finding new limits. People who lived this way grew fluent in these sounds. They learned which ones belonged to normal temperature shifts and which ones demanded attention. Your ears sharpen without effort. You are not straining to listen, you are simply available. This is a different kind of awareness than daytime vigilance. It is passive receptive. One commonly noted feature in frontier memoirs is how nighttime listening became a learned skill passed down without instruction. Children absorbed it by lying awake beside adults, hearing what was ignored and what was acknowledged. The fire contributes its own vocabulary. Even dying embers speak, a faint collapse, a whisper of ash settling inward. These sounds reassure you that heat existed recently, that it has not vanished completely. Silence from the hearth would mean something different. Many settlers described waking briefly, just to confirm that the fire had not gone out entirely, then falling back into sleep once that question was answered. Wind joins the conversation next. It does not roar, it tests. It moves around the cabin, pressing lightly. At first, then more insistently. You hear it find a seam and explore it, producing a thin sigh near the floor. This sound is familiar enough to be unremarkable. A draft you know is less dangerous than one you do not. One frontier woman wrote that she preferred to hear the cold entering because it allowed her to plan around it. You shift slightly and listen again. The sound changes pitch as someone else moves nearby, blocking the airflow with a body or blanket. The cabin responds by quieting. This interaction feels almost cooperative, bodies, fabric and wood adjusting together. There are other sounds you are alert for. A footstep where no one should be moving. The scrape of something against the door. The bell near the entrance, if there is one, hangs silent for now. Such bells were not meant to frighten intruders. They were meant to announce change. A subtle but widely recognised practice among settlers was favouring notice over prevention. Knowing something was happening gave you options. Being surprised took them away. You listen for animals too, not out of fear exactly, but awareness. Wolves, coyotes, even livestock could move close to cabins at night. Their presence often announced itself through sound, long before it became visible. There are scattered reports of families identifying specific animals by rhythm alone, the pacing of steps, or the pattern of breathing outside the wall. Whether this skill was as widespread as later stories suggest remains an open question among researchers, but the confidence with which some accounts describe it is striking. Inside, breathing forms another layer of sound, slow, steady, overlapping. You become aware of how quiet it is collectively. No one snores loudly. No one shifts dramatically. This is not coincidence. Loud sleepers were gently repositioned over time, trained without words to settle more quietly. Sleep here is social. Individual habits adjust to group needs. A curious detail, mentioned in a frontier medical guide, advises families to pay attention to coughing patterns at night as they could indicate drafts or early illness. Listening was diagnostic as well as protective. You notice now how even small sounds carry meaning when everything else is still. Your own breathing softens further as you match the rhythm around you. This synchronization happens naturally. It reduces movement. It conserves warmth. There is some academic debate about whether such unconscious coordination improved overall sleep quality or simply reduced nighttime disturbances, but its prevalence suggests it served a purpose. You hear snow slide from the roof again, a soft rush followed by a dull thud. That sound carries information too. It means accumulation has reached a certain point. It means insulation above you has shifted. Snow on a roof could be protective, blocking wind and adding thermal mass. Some settlers even welcomed heavy snowfall for this reason, despite the inconvenience it caused elsewhere. This dual role of snow as both threat and ally continues to be discussed by historians studying winter survival strategies. The cabin settles into a new equilibrium. Sounds space themselves out. The wind backs off slightly. The fire quiets. Bodies remain still. This is the moment when sleep deepens if it is going to. You let it happen gradually. Sudden surrender is rare here. Sleep arrives in layers just like warmth. Your mind drifts but does not disconnect completely. Part of you remains tuned to the environment. This is not anxiety, it is readiness. Frontier accounts often describe sleep as light but sufficient, shaped by necessity rather than ideal conditions. People rested enough to function, not enough to forget where they were. There is a faint creak near the door. You register it, then dismiss it. Wood responding to temperature again. The difference between dismissal and alarm is experience. Without it, every sound would be frightening. With it, most become background. This filtering ability was essential. Constant fear wastes energy. You think briefly about how different this is from modern silence. Here, silence is layered. It contains information. Complete quiet would feel unnatural. The absence of expected sounds could signal danger just as surely as unexpected noise. A fringe anecdote from a Minnesota settlement describes a family waking in panic because the usual wind noise had stopped during a blizzard later, realizing that snow had sealed the cabin so tightly that airflow was reduced. You adjust your head slightly on whatever serves as a pillow, straw-folded cloth, maybe a sack. It rustles softly, then settles. You wait a moment to be sure no new drafts have opened. None do. The system holds. As sleep deepens, the sounds fade from conscious attention, but not from awareness. They remain as a kind of background knowledge, ready to surface if needed. This is how people slept through long winters, not by shutting the world out, but by listening just enough. The cabin continues its quiet conversation through the night. Wood speaks, wind replies, fire murmurs in its sleep, and you, wrapped in layers of sound and stillness, let yourself drift confident that you will wake if the language changes. At some point in the night, you realize that cold itself is not the main adversary. Wind is. Cold can be tolerated, it can be layered against, planned for, negotiated with. Wind ignores all that. It finds weaknesses. It exploits mistakes. Many frontier settlers came to understand this distinction intuitively, even if they never articulated it directly. A commonly recognized reality in winter survival accounts is that still cold was far easier to manage than moving air at the same temperature. You feel it first along the floor, a thin, deliberate movement brushing your ankles, testing whether the cabin has grown careless. Drafts behave like water. They seek the lowest point, then spread outward. This is why people stuffed rags, straw, even old paper, into cracks along the base of walls and doors. These were not permanent fixes. They were nightly defences, adjusted as conditions changed. You shift your feet slightly, tucking them deeper beneath the blankets. The draft fades, redirected by fabric and body placement. This response is automatic now. No thought, just correction. Settlers developed these reflexes quickly. Those who did not suffered cold feet, restless nights, and illness that followed days later. You listen for the sound of wind itself. It does not howl yet. It presses. It rubs against the logs, producing a low, uneven rasp. Each wall responds differently. The north side groans more deeply. That wall takes the brunt of it. Cabins were often oriented with this in mind, but geography did not always cooperate. Trees, hills, and open ground altered wind behaviour in unpredictable ways. You remember how people prepared for this before nightfall? Extra chinking pressed into suspect seams, blankets hung over door frames, furniture nudged closer to vulnerable walls. These adjustments were not decorative, they were defensive. A lesser-known observation from a frontier builder's manual notes that families often rearranged interior layouts seasonally, shifting beds and storage to counter prevailing winds. Wind also changes sound. It carries distant noises closer. A branch snapping far away sounds near. An animal moving across frozen ground seems louder closer than it is. This distortion required experience to interpret. Panic came from misreading distance. Those who learned to listen calmly conserved energy and avoided unnecessary reactions. You feel the cabin respond as a unit. Walls flex slightly, roof timbers tighten, Snow packed against the exterior dampens some of the vibration. Snow is complicated this way. It blocks wind but adds weight. There are accounts of settlers welcoming early snowfall because it sealed gaps, then worrying later when accumulation grew heavy. This balance between insulation and risk remains a topic of discussion among historians studying winter structures. Inside, bodies adjust again. Someone near the wall shifts closer to the center. Blankets are pulled tighter along the edge. No one speaks. This coordination happens without instruction. It has been practiced many times before. Wind teaches cooperation efficiently. You notice how the fire's absence makes wind more noticeable. Heat masks drafts by creating upward air movement. As warmth fades, wind becomes more assertive. This is one reason fires were often allowed to die gradually rather than suddenly. A sharp loss of heat invited aggressive drafts that unsettled sleep. You think briefly about how people described wind psychologically. Cold was expected. Wind felt personal. It was blamed for illness, bad moods, even poor decisions. Some of this was superstition, but some was experiential. Wind dries skin, irritates lungs, and saps energy faster than still air. People noticed these effects long before they understood the mechanics. There is ongoing scholarly debate about how much wind exposure contributed to respiratory illness versus overcrowding and smoke inhalation. The truth likely lies in combination. Wind-chilled bodies smoke irritated lungs, and close quarters spread infection. None alone were decisive. Together, they created vulnerability. You press your shoulder more firmly against the mattress, or bedding sealing one more potential gap. This pressure creates a barrier. Bodies were used deliberately this way. Adults often slept on the outer edges, not only to buffer children, but to act as movable insulation. Their larger mass reduced airflow more effectively than any blanket could. The wind changes direction slightly. The sound shifts. A new seam is tested. You register it and adjust again, barely waking. This responsiveness is what kept people alive through nights that would seem unbearable now. Not toughness, responsiveness. A curious tidbit appears in a frontier letter from the Rocky Mountain region, describing how some families burned a small amount of damp wood early in the evening to increase humidity and reduce the sting of wind drafts later at night. Whether this practice was effective or simply comforting is still debated, but it shows how attentively people observed their environment. You become aware of how wind interacts with smell. Cold air carries scent differently. Smoke lingers. Earth smells flatten. Animal scents sharpen. These changes inform decisions too. A strong animal smell near the cabin might prompt someone to stay half awake longer than usual. Gradually the wind eases, or perhaps you simply adapt to it. The distinction becomes less important as the system stabilizes again. Drafts are blocked, bodies are positioned, blankets are sealed, the cabin holds. You feel a quiet satisfaction, not pride but equilibrium. Wind has been managed, not defeated. That is enough. Sleep deepens again, shaped by the knowledge that you and the cabin are still negotiating, still adjusting, still holding ground. Outside, the wind moves on to test other structures, other weaknesses. Inside, you remain warm enough. And in frontier terms, warm enough meant alive, rested, and ready for morning. At some point, your awareness brushes against the small systems meant to warn rather than stop. Out here, barriers were rare. Early cabins were not fortresses. They relied on notice, not resistance. A frequently mentioned feature in settlement narratives is the presence of simple, alert tools near the door chosen for reliability rather than intimidation. A bell tied to a leather thong, a hanging piece of metal. Sometimes nothing more than a loose board positioned to complain loudly if moved. You picture the bell now hanging motionless. It is not decorative. It does not gleam. It exists solely to speak if the door shifts. That is enough. The sound would cut through sleep faster than shouting. People trusted these small alarms because they worked in darkness and cold when human senses dulled. Dogs often filled this role too. Not pets in the modern sense, but living sensors with opinions. Many frontier families kept dogs specifically for nighttime awareness. They slept lightly, ears tuned outward. A low growl or sudden movement was enough to wake everyone. One widely accepted observation from homestead records is that dogs were valued less for defense than for notice. They rarely attacked, they announced. You do not hear a dog tonight, but you imagine where one would lie close to the door or just inside the threshold. Dogs learned the cabin's rhythms the same way people did. They distinguished between normal wind noise and something that deserved attention. Some accounts describe dogs ignoring storms entirely, but reacting instantly to unfamiliar footsteps. Whether this was instinct or training remains debated among historians who study human-animal relationships on the frontier. You think about how this reliance on warning shaped behavior. People slept differently, knowing they would be alerted, not fearless but less tense. Fear requires uncertainty. Notice reduces it. Even the presence of a bell, silent as it is now, calms the mind. There were other quiet alarms too. Pots hung loosely on nails. Tools leaned just enough to fall if disturbed. These were not traps. They were conversations waiting to happen. A fringe detail from a Colorado mining settlement describes a man arranging his tin cup on the door latch each night so it would rattle if opened. He wrote that the sound was comforting, even when it did not occur. You listen again. Nothing. The absence of sound becomes information. The bell remains still. The door does not shift. Wind brushes the outside but does not cross the threshold. This is the ideal state. Alert systems exist to stay silent. Inside, bodies remain relaxed but ready. Someone near the door is positioned deliberately, larger frame turned outward. This placement appears again and again in family accounts rarely commented on. It was understood who slept where and why. Children were protected inward. Adults formed the perimeter. There is some scholarly disagreement about how much these arrangements reduced actual risk versus perceived risk. The statistical likelihood of nighttime intrusion was low in many areas, yet the rituals persisted. Some argue that the routines mattered more psychologically than practically. Others point to documented cases where early warning prevented disaster. The truth likely sits between. Systems that rarely activate still shape behavior. You notice how that these quiet alarms integrate seamlessly with the rest of the nighttime strategy. They require no fuel, no effort once set. They do not interfere with warmth. They simply exist ready. This efficiency mattered. Anything that demanded constant attention was a liability at night. The idea of security here feels different than modern locks and barriers. There is no assumption of total safety. Instead, there is preparedness. If something happens, you want time to respond. That is all. Time to wake, time to gather children, time to decide whether to confront or retreat. Early warning provides that margin. You recall reading accounts where families slept through storms, but woke instantly to a single, unfamiliar sound. The human brain learns patterns quickly. Repetition breeds comfort. Variation triggers response. This pattern recognition was a survival skill honed nightly. A curious anecdote from a Great Plains settlement tells of a family whose bell froze in place during an extreme cold snap, silencing their usual alarm. They did not sleep well that night, despite no actual threat. The absence of the expected system unsettled them more than any sound would have. You adjust your position slightly, mindful not to disturb the balance near the door. Blankets shift but hold. The quiet remains intact. Your breathing slows again, reassured. There is also the knowledge that help, if needed, would not arrive quickly. Neighbours might be miles away. Roads invisible under snow. Night travel dangerous. This reality shaped expectations. You relied first on yourself, then on what was inside your walls. Warning systems acknowledge this truth without dramatizing it. You think about how this constant low-level readiness affected sleep over months and years. Did it wear people down or sharpen them? Historians still debate whether frontier sleep was more fragmented than modern sleep or simply differently structured. Many accounts suggest people adapted, finding rest within vigilance rather than despite it. The bell remains silent. The dog, if present, does not stir. Wind slides past without incident. The cabin holds its breath along with you. As the night deepens, these systems fade into the background of awareness. You do not think about them actively. You simply trust that they will speak if needed. This trust allows deeper rest. It is earned through repetition. Night after night of nothing happening builds confidence. You feel that confidence now, subtle but real. The quiet is not empty. It is layered with preparation. The cold waits, the wind tests, the cabin listens. And you, supported by small thoughtful choices made before sleep, drift further into rest, knowing that if something changes, you will know. For now, nothing does. And that in this place is success. Sometime before sleep fully claims you, attention turns inward toward food. Not hunger exactly, but awareness. What you ate before night matters now. A routinely noted reality. In frontier journals is that evening meals were planned with sleep in mind, not indulgence. Calories were protection. The body needed fuel to generate heat through long hours of stillness. Going to bed hungry in winter was not a test of discipline. It was a mistake. You feel the quiet weight in your stomach, neither full nor empty. That balance was intentional. Heavy meals produced warmth at first, but they also demanded energy to digest, sometimes disrupting rest. Light meals failed to sustain heat through the coldest hours before dawn. Families learned through repetition, rather than theory, where the line sat for their bodies. Common evening foods reflected this knowledge: stews, breads, fats, things that released energy slowly. A mainstream observation from settlement records is that fats were prized in winter, not for flavour, but for endurance. Butterlard rendered animal fat. These were valued for how they carried warmth through the night. Sugar gave quick energy, but faded too fast to be trusted alone. You remember how people timed eating carefully. Supper came late enough that digestion overlapped with the first hours of sleep. Heat generated by the body's own work complemented the fire while it lasted. This overlap was deliberate. Some families even delayed lying down until digestion had clearly begun, sitting quietly near the hearth to let warmth build from both sources. There is an understated intimacy in this routine, eating together, then settling together. The transition from nourishment to rest feels continuous rather than abrupt. Modern separations between dining and sleeping did not exist here. Everything flowed into everything else. A quirky detail appears in a frontier diary from the Ohio Valley, describing how a family saved the crusts of bread specifically for late evening consumption, believing they lasted longer in the body. Whether this belief had physiological merit remains debated, but the practice itself reflects close observation and adaptation. You notice how your breathing feels slightly warmer than earlier. Digestion contributes, quietly raising internal temperature by degrees you cannot measure but can sense. This warmth spreads slowly, reinforcing what blankets and clothing already hold. It is subtle but meaningful. Children were especially sensitive to this. Parents paid close attention to whether children ate enough before bed. Night hunger led to restless sleep, crying, and increased susceptibility to cold. Accounts often mention mothers urging one more bite, not out of concern for manners but survival. Refusal was not indulged. There is ongoing scholarly discussion about how nutritional patterns on the frontier affected nighttime mortality, particularly among the very young and very old. While definitive conclusions are difficult, patterns emerge in personal accounts that link adequate evening nutrition with better resilience during extreme cold spells. You recall how certain foods were avoided at night. Beans, for instance, appear frequently in lists of daytime meals, but less often at supper. Discomfort disrupted sleep. Sleep disruption led to cold exposure. Every choice cascaded forward. The smell of food lingers faintly in the cabin. Cooked grain, fat, smoke. These scents are grounding. They signal continuity. Even in hardship, routines persist. Eating before sleep marks a transition into night, a small ritual that frames rest. You think briefly about scarcity again. Food like wood had to be managed. Eating enough without eating too much required trust in future supplies. This balance shaped attitudes toward appetite. People learned to listen to their bodies carefully, not suppressing hunger, not indulging excess. There is a fringe story from a prairie settlement describing how a family once skipped supper to conserve food during a lean winter, only to wake repeatedly through the night from cold and weakness. They resumed a modest evening meals afterward, accepting the trade-off. Experience corrected theory. You feel the weight of digestion settle lower as your body relaxes. Muscles loosen slightly. Warmth deepens at the core. This is when sleep begins to take hold more firmly. The body has what it needs for now. Some settlers believed certain foods carried protective qualities beyond calories. Broths were thought to strengthen the chest. Milk to calm the mind. Whether these beliefs were accurate or comforting is difficult to separate. What matters is that they guided behavior in ways that often supported rest. You notice how the timing of hunger changes during winter. Appetite shifts earlier. The body anticipates long nights and compensates. This seasonal rhythm appears repeatedly in historical observations, though rarely commented on explicitly. People adjusted without naming the change. As sleep deepens, digestion continues quietly generating warmth, without demanding attention. This internal fire complements the external one that has now faded. Together they carry you through the coldest stretch of night. You sense that survival here depends on layering systems not just outside the body, but within it. Food becomes insulation. Routine becomes protection. The body is not passive in this environment. It participates actively. Your thoughts slow further now. The awareness of hunger fades, replaced by steadiness. You feel prepared, not anxious. The night is long, but you have done what you can. Outside, the cold continues its patient work. Inside, your body answers in small chemical reactions, invisible but effective. Heat is being made held. You let this knowledge settle you. Sleep arrives more fully now, supported by nourishment, chosen with care, timing learned through generations. The cabin holds, your body holds, and for a while the cold waits. At some point in the night, your attention settles on the smallest bodies in the room. Children sleep differently, not lighter exactly, but more visibly. Their breathing changes more noticeably with temperature. Their movements are quicker, less economical. Frontier families understood this without formal study. A broadly recognized pattern in settlement households was that children were considered the first indicators of thermal trouble. If a child stirred, kicked, or whimpered, adults adjusted the system immediately. You watch how a child nearby curls inward, knees, drawn up arms, tucked close. This posture appears again and again in historical descriptions, often without comment. It is instinctive. Smaller bodies lose heat faster. Curling reduces exposed surface area. No one teaches this directly. Children learn it through experience, night after night. Blankets are arranged with extra care around them. Edges are tucked, gaps sealed. Adults sacrifice comfort without discussion. This is not framed as generosity, it is necessity. A child who sleeps poorly becomes sick more easily. Illness in winter spreads quickly and drains resources. Protecting children protects the household. There is a quiet, educational process happening here, though no one calls it that. Children absorb routines through repetition. They learn when to be still. They learn how to shift without opening drafts. They learn that crying wastes energy and breath. This is not cruelty, it is adaptation. Accounts from the period often describe children as remarkably stoic by modern standards, though whether this reflects reality or selective memory is still debated by social historians. You notice how children are placed between adults, not only for warmth, but for regulation. Adult bodies act as stabilizers. Their slower breathing and steadier temperature create a buffer. Children synchronize to this rhythm over time. This synchronization reduces nighttime disturbances and conserves heat for everyone. A curious detail from a frontier midwife's notes mentions that infants who slept closest to adults tended to gain weight more steadily during winter months. Whether this was due to warmth feeding frequency or reduced stress remains an open question, but the observation itself speaks to how attentively people watch these patterns. You think about how cold shapes childhood memory. Many adults who later wrote about their frontier upbringing described winter nights vividly. The smell of wool, the weight of blankets, the sound of wind. These sensory memories persisted long after details of daily labour faded. Night was where the environment made its strongest impression. Children were not shielded from cold entirely. That would have been impossible. Instead, they were introduced to it gradually within managed boundaries. Hands exposed briefly, then warmed. Breath visible, then hidden under blankets. This controlled exposure taught respect rather than fear. There is scholarly discussion about whether such early exposure increased resilience or simply reflected unavoidable conditions. Modern interpretations vary. What is clear from first-hand accounts is that children adapted quickly. Complaints were rare not because discomfort was absent, but because expectations were different. You recall stories of children assigned small nighttime tasks as they grew older, adjusting a blanket, checking a draft, listening for specific sounds. These responsibilities were light but meaningful. They integrated children into the shared system of survival. Participation replaced anxiety. A fringe anecdote from a Montana homestead describes a child waking his parents because he recognized a new wind sound near the door, something adults had missed in their deeper sleep. The story is often told with pride, but it also illustrates how early attentiveness was cultivated naturally. Illness complicates everything. When a child develops a fever or cough, nighttime routines change. Distance is adjusted carefully. Warmth is increased without overheating. Sleep becomes lighter for everyone. Frontier families lacked modern medicine, but they compensated with constant observation. Night was when symptoms revealed themselves most clearly. There is disagreement among historians about how effective these methods were in preventing serious illness. Mortality rates were undeniably high by modern standards. Yet within those constraints, families did what they could. They adapted routines to circumstances with remarkable flexibility. You notice how children are rarely left alone at night. Even older ones sleep within earshot. Privacy yields to safety. This closeness does not seem to trouble them. It is normal. Solitude is a concept associated with daylight, not darkness. The cold teaches children patience early. Sudden movement is discouraged not through punishment, but consequence. Kick off a blanket and you feel it immediately. Wake someone unnecessarily and you disturb the whole system. Feedback is immediate and clear. You hear a child sigh in sleep, a small sound that draws attention without alarm. An adult shifts slightly, adjusting a blanket edge. The sigh fades, balance restored, no words needed. There is something quietly profound about how these lessons embed themselves. Children do not learn survival as a dramatic narrative. They learn it as routine, as rhythm, as expectation. By the time they are grown, these habits feel natural, even when conditions improve. You think about how modern childhood often separates learning from environment. Here, environment is the teacher. Cold instructs directly. Warmth rewards cooperation. Sleep becomes both rest and rehearsal. Some later commentators romanticized this upbringing, portraying it as character building. Others criticized it as unnecessarily harsh. The truth likely resists simple judgment. What mattered then was continuity. Children who learned these patterns early were better prepared for the nights ahead. You feel your own body relax as the room settles again. Children sleep quietly, now tucked into the center of warmth. The system holds because everyone understands their place within it, even the smallest. Outside, the cold does not care about age. Inside, the family compensates, distributing warmth where it is needed most. This quiet redistribution happens night after night, shaping not just survival, but memory. As sleep deepens, the children's breathing blends into the larger rhythm of the room. They are learning even now, though they will not remember it consciously. The lessons will surface years later in how they dress, how they sleep, how they respond to cold without thinking. For now they rest, protected not by walls alone, but by patterns learned and shared. And you rest too, aware that in this place, survival was taught softly in the dark, through warmth passed hand to hand. As the night settles into its deepest stretch, you become aware of the quiet work that never fully stops. It does not announce itself. It moves softly at the edges of rest. Much of it belongs to the women of the household, though no one would have framed it that way at the time. In many frontier homes, a broadly acknowledged reality was that women carried the invisible responsibility of keeping nights functional even while appearing to rest. You sense it in the small movements that do not fully wake anyone. A hand reaching to retuck a blanket edge, a foot nudging a child closer to warmth, a pause in breathing as someone listens, then relaxes again. These actions are economical, practiced and constant. They happen without ceremony. If they succeed, no one notices. If they fail, everyone does. You think about how much preparation occurred before night ever arrived. Bedding aired and dried when possible. Clothing mended not for appearance but for draft prevention. Gaps in blankets stitched closed. These tasks often fell into women's routines simply because they were already managing cloth, food and children. The work extended into night not because of expectation, but because night exposed mistakes. A lesser-known detail from homestead letters describes women sleeping more lightly than men during winter months, not out of anxiety, but because their attention remained half engaged with the room. Whether this was universal or selectively remembered remains debated, but the pattern appears frequently enough to suggest it was common. You notice how someone rises briefly and quietly moving toward the hearth, not to stoke it aggressively, but to check its state. A small adjustment, a piece of ash shifted to preserve embers just a little longer. This intervention is subtle. It extends warmth without committing to a full burn. Such techniques were learned through long practice. Overcorrection wasted fuel. Undercorrection invited cold. There is scholarly discussion about how gendered labour on the frontier became less visible, precisely because it blended into domestic routine so seamlessly. Nighttime management was part of this invisibility. It was expected, but rarely acknowledged directly. Yet without it, systems failed. You consider how illness sharpened this role. When someone coughed in the night, it was often a woman who noticed first, who listened for changes, who adjusted warmth, offered water, repositioned bodies to ease breathing. Medical knowledge was limited, but observation was acute. Night revealed symptoms that daylight hid. A quirky observation from a pioneer doctor's notes mentions that women were often better at predicting illness outcomes simply because they spent more time awake with patients at night watching patterns emerge. This attentiveness substituted for tools they did not have. You feel the room settle again after the brief movement. No one comments, no one needs to. The work has been done. Warmth redistributed, drafts sealed, sleep resumes. You think about how this constant quiet labour shaped exhaustion. Rest here was partial, fragmented, yet people adapted. Light sleep became normal. Deep, uninterrupted sleep was rare but not required. What mattered was enough rest to function the next day. There is disagreement among historians about whether such sleep patterns were harmful long-term or simply different from modern expectations. Some argue chronic sleep deprivation was common. Others suggest people adapted physiologically and psychologically. Frontier accounts often describe fatigue, but they also describe resilience that does not fit neatly into modern categories. You notice how the person who moved earlier now settles back into place, body relaxing gradually. Their breathing deepens, but not fully. Part of them remains alert. This dual state becomes habitual. Awareness without tension, readiness without fear. The work extends beyond immediate warmth. Someone checks that water is not frozen near the bed, that a child's hair is dry, that a garment has not twisted uncomfortably. These details matter more at night than during the day. Discomfort that can be ignored in daylight becomes dangerous when movement stops. You think about how this labour was learned, rarely through instruction, more often through watching older women absorbing timing and restraint, knowing when to act and when to leave things alone. Over-intervention could wake the room and waste warmth. Under-intervention allowed problems to grow. A fringe anecdote from a Wisconsin settlement describes a young woman scolded gently for adding too much wood to the fire at night, creating heat early but cold later. The lesson was not framed as criticism, it was framed as care for the morning. You realize that this work was not solitary. Men contributed differently. Children learned gradually, but the coordination often rested on one or two people who held the pattern together. Their reward was continuity, not recognition. You sense a deep familiarity in these movements. The cabin has been lived in long enough for everyone to know its moods. Which corner chills first? Which blanket slips most easily? Which child kicks in sleep? This knowledge accumulates slowly and disappears if the family moves on. There is a quiet sadness in that impermanence. Cabins changed hands, families relocated. The knowledge embedded in those walls did not always transfer. New occupants had to relearn everything. Night by night, you feel grateful in a distant way for the competence surrounding you, for the fact that you can rest without managing every detail yourself. Someone else is listening, someone else is adjusting. This shared responsibility allows deeper sleep even if it remains light. Outside, the cold persists. Inside, the system continues to adapt. The work does not stop until morning, but it does not demand constant effort either. It ebbs and flows with need. As sleep pulls you further down, you are dimly aware of another small adjustment. A blanket lifted and resettled, a body shifted slightly to block a draft, then stillness again. This is the labour that does not appear in heroic stories. It does not leave marks on the landscape, but without it, nights like this would have been far more dangerous. Survival depended not just on strength or planning, but on attentiveness, practiced quietly, repeatedly, and without applause. You let that thought fade as your breathing slows. The room holds. The patterns continue. And for now, that is enough to carry everyone safely toward morning. At some point during the night, your awareness drifts briefly beyond the walls. Not because you plan to go outside, but because someone already has. In many frontier households, a quietly accepted reality was that men often handled the exterior risks, even at night when exposure carried the greatest cost. This was not bravado, it was assignment. Certain tasks could not wait until morning. You imagine the door opening just enough to let a body slip through. The sound is careful, controlled. Cold rushes in, immediately sharp and impatient, but it is cut off again as the door closes. Inside, everyone shifts slightly instinctively, sealing the space. Outside, the cold behaves differently. It is not pulled and slowed, it is direct. The person outside moves quickly, but not hurried. Speed wastes breath, breath freezes on eyelashes. Snow crunches underfoot with that unmistakable, brittle sound. The night sky is enormous here, stars sharp and close, offering no warmth at all. A well-attested observation in frontier writings is that nighttime outdoor exposure was often more dangerous than daytime cold, because fatigue lowered judgment and reaction time. These excursions were usually short, checking the roof after heavy snow, ensuring livestock had not broken loose, making sure the woodpile cover still held. Even a few minutes could cost warmth that took hours to regain. People learned to prepare mentally before stepping out, rehearsing what needed to be done to avoid unnecessary delay. You feel how the cold clings when the person returns. Snow brushed off at the threshold, boots left near the door, clothing stiff with frost. The air around them feels colder for a moment, as if the night has followed them inside. Someone near the hearth shifts, offering space for rewarming. This transition is delicate. Too close to heat too quickly can hurt, too far leaves cold embedded. There is scholarly discussion about how gendered these nighttime roles truly were, with some evidence suggesting women also took exterior duties when circumstances required. Yet many accounts describe men as default night checkers, likely due to clothing size or social expectation rather than inherent ability. Practicality shaped roles more than ideology. You sense how these brief exits influence sleep. Everyone rests a little lighter until the person returns. Once they do, the room exhales collectively. The perimeter has been checked. For now, nothing threatens. That knowledge allows rest to deepen again. A curious anecdote from a frontier fort settlement describes men marking familiar paths in the snow during daylight so they could navigate at night without lanterns, preserving night vision and avoiding open flames. Whether this practice was widespread is debated, but it reflects how carefully people thought about nighttime exposure. The cold outside feels different from the cold inside. Inside, it is negotiated. Outside, it dominates. Wind strips heat immediately. Snow reflects moonlight harshly. Sound carries farther. These differences made people reluctant to step out unless necessary. When they did, it was with purpose. You notice how the person who returned does not speak. There is no report given unless something is wrong. Silence is information. Everything is fine. Words are unnecessary. This economy of communication conserves warmth and avoids stirring others. Over time, these exterior checks become routine, folded into the rhythm of the night. Not every night requires them. But during storms or uncertain conditions, they are expected. Children grow up aware that someone may leave and return while they sleep, trusting that this vigilance keeps them safe. There is debate among historians about how much these practices reduced actual risk versus reinforcing a sense of control. Frontier life involved many uncontrollable variables. Night checks offered at least the illusion of agency. That alone may have been valuable. You think about the toll this took on bodies. Repeated exposure to extreme cold followed by rewarming, stressed joints and lungs. Many later accounts mention chronic pain traced back to winter nights spent outdoors. Yet the work continued. Survival demanded it. You feel gratitude again, quiet and unspoken. Someone is willing to step into the cold so others can remain still. This division of labour, though rarely discussed explicitly, underpinned nighttime safety. The cabin settles once more after the brief disruption. Heat redistributes, blankets are adjusted, breathing slows. The outside world recedes again, held at bay by wood and habit. You let your thoughts drift, trusting that if the door opens again, you will know. For now, it remains closed. The cold presses but does not enter, and you rest supported by vigilance that operates even while most sleep. As the night wears on, your awareness sharpens around a different kind of threat. Illness does not announce itself loudly at first. It creeps in quietly, often mistaken for simple fatigue or cold. On the frontier, a broadly recognized reality was that sickness became most dangerous after sundown, when warmth dropped and bodies stopped moving. Night exposed weakness in ways daylight did not. You listen for coughing now, not just as sound but as pattern, dry or wet, frequent or occasional. Each variation carried meaning. People learned these distinctions through long familiarity, not formal training. A cough that lingered too long in the dark could prompt immediate adjustments. Extra blankets, a shift closer to the fire, a body repositioned to ease breathing. You feel how illness changes the balance of warmth. Fever produces heat, but it is unreliable. Sweating becomes a problem. Damp clothing steals warmth once fever breaks. Frontier families learn to manage this, carefully increasing insulation without trapping moisture. This was delicate work, especially in a room already crowded. There is a persistent scholarly debate about how effective these nighttime care practices were in preventing serious outcomes. Mortality rates remained high, particularly among infants and the elderly. Yet personal accounts consistently emphasize vigilance rather than resignation. People did not give up at night. They watched more closely. You notice how someone near you stirs, listening more intently now. A hand rests briefly on a forehead, gauging temperature by feel alone. Thermometers were rare and unreliable. Touch became the primary diagnostic tool. Warmth meant one thing during the day and something else entirely at night. A quirky detail from a frontier medical journal describes caregivers noting how breath sounded in cold air to judge lung involvement. Wheezing, rattling, shallow rhythm. These observations guided decisions long before dawn. Whether such assessments were accurate is debated, but they informed action. You sense how illness altered sleeping arrangements. Distance increased slightly to reduce spread, but not so much that warmth was lost. Blankets were reassigned, bodies repositioned. The system adapted again, trading one risk for another. Nothing was ideal, everything was negotiated. Children and elders were watched most closely. Their reserves were smaller. A restless child drew attention quickly. An elderly person sleeping too still raised concern. Night magnified these signals. There were no distractions, only listening. You think about how fear interacted with illness. Panic wasted energy and warmth. Calm observation conserved both. Frontier accounts often emphasize composure in caregiving, though whether this reflects reality or idealized memory is uncertain. Still, the emphasis on calm appears repeatedly. A fringe anecdote from a prairie settlement describes a woman waking hourly to check her husband's breathing during a severe winter illness, using the rhythm to decide whether to wake him for water or let him rest. Such stories reveal how attentiveness replaced medicine. You notice how even minor illness changed the soundscape. Breathing louder, movements more frequent. These changes prevented deep sleep for everyone nearby, but they also ensured rapid response. Sleep became communal again, not just for warmth but for care. There is disagreement among historians about whether close quarters accelerated disease spread, or whether the benefits of shared warmth outweighed the risks. The evidence is mixed. What is clear is that families rarely had the option to isolate completely. They worked within constraints. You feel your own body register these sounds, even if no one is ill tonight. The possibility shapes vigilance. Winter nights trained people to treat health as dynamic, changing hour by hour. What felt manageable at dusk could become dangerous by dawn. You sense how care routines softened fear. Action replaced helplessness. Even small adjustments felt meaningful. A blanket pulled tighter, a drink of water offered, a head elevated slightly. These acts did not guarantee recovery, but they restored agency. The night stretches on. Illness, if present, is held in check for now. The system adapts and stabilizes again. Bodies settle, breathing evens out. Watchfulness remains, but it relaxes slightly. You let your awareness drift back toward rest, comforted by the knowledge that even in the absence of cures, people did not face sickness passively. They responded with observation, patience, and shared effort. Outside, the cold remains indifferent. Inside, care fills the gaps where medicine cannot reach. And as sleep deepens once more, you rest within a network that listens, adjusts, and holds steady until morning light offers new options. Sometime in the deep hours, you notice a strange comfort settling in. It comes not from warmth alone, but from weight above you. Snow has begun to work in your favour. A well-established point in winter settlement records is that accumulated snow around and atop a cabin could act as insulation, muting wind and slowing heat loss. It is counterintuitive at first. Snow feels cold to the touch, yet once it stays still, it becomes a quiet ally. You hear it earlier than you feel it. A soft hush as flakes gather, then a gentler sound as wind loses its sharp edge, muffled by white. The cabin's voice changes. Drafts weaken. The roof creaks less insistently. Inside, the air feels steadier, as if the room has decided to stop arguing with the night. People noticed this effect long before they understood why it worked. They simply knew that a cabin wrapped in snow slept differently than one exposed. Some settlers even described feeling relief when a storm arrived, despite the labour it promised in the morning. The night at least would be calmer. You imagine how snow piles along the base of the walls, sealing tiny gaps where air once crept in. This sealing was temporary and unpredictable, but it mattered. A fringe detail from a Northern Plains homestead account describes a family intentionally shoveling snow against the windward side of their cabin, after noticing how much warmer it stayed during drifts. Whether this was common practice or an isolated experiment remains uncertain, but the observation itself shows how closely people watched their environment. The roof benefits too, up to a point. Snow dampens vibration, reducing the rattling that keeps light sleepers awake. It also blocks radiative heat loss, reflecting warmth back downward. Yet this same weight could become dangerous if accumulation grew too heavy. There are documented cases of roof collapse during severe winters, reminding settlers that every advantage carried risk. You sense this balance now. Comfort mixed with caution. Snow is welcome but not blindly trusted. Someone near the wall shifts slightly, listening for changes. The sound of snow sliding off the roof earlier is remembered. If too much gathers, it will announce itself eventually. There is academic disagreement about how much insulation snow realistically provided compared to other factors like wall thickness and fuel management. Some studies suggest its effect was modest. Others argue it played a significant role during extreme cold spells. Personal accounts, however, consistently mention the subjective relief snow brought at night, which may matter just as much as measured temperature changes. You feel the air inside grow more even, the sharp contrasts soften. There is still cold, but it no longer feels invasive. This steadiness allows deeper rest. Bodies relax incrementally. Blankets feel more effective. Breathing slows further. Snow also changes sound outside. Distant noises fade. Footsteps become muted. The world beyond the cabin feels farther away. This isolation can be unsettling, but it can also be calming. Many settlers described snow as making the night feel smaller, enclosing the cabin in a quieter sphere. You think about how this affected perception of time. Snowstorms blurred boundaries between night and day. Darkness lingered. Morning came late and muted. This temporal distortion shaped winter routines. Sleep stretched and segmented, naturally responding to environment rather than schedule. There is a curious anecdote from a Scandinavian immigrant letter describing how children slept longer during snowbound nights, waking later and calmer than usual. Whether this was due to improved insulation or simply reduced noise is unclear, but the pattern was noted with appreciation. You notice how moisture behaves differently now. The air feels slightly heavier. Breath does not vanish as quickly. This humidity reduces the sting of cold on exposed skin. Lips crack less, throats feel less raw. Snow moderates not just temperature, but texture. Yet snow also brings responsibility. It must be managed eventually. Paths cleared, roofs checked, woodpile accessed. These tasks wait for daylight, but awareness of them lingers. People slept knowing that morning would demand effort. This knowledge influenced how deeply they rested. Sleep was valuable. It prepared the body for work ahead. You hear a faint slide again, snow shifting off the roof. The sound is reassuring. It means accumulation is self-correcting, at least for now. Someone stirs briefly, then settles again. The system acknowledges the change and moves on. There is an old debate among historians about whether settlers truly appreciated snow's insulating qualities or simply accepted them as incidental. The truth may be that appreciation grew over time, learned through contrast. Nights without snow felt harsher. Nights with it felt contained. Experience taught preference. You feel that preference now. The cabin feels wrapped held. The wind's probing has slowed. The cold still presses, but it does so evenly without sudden fingers slipping through cracks. Sleep deepens accordingly. Dreams become steadier. The mind releases some vigilance, trusting that the environment has stabilized for the moment. This trust is conditional, but it is enough. Snow continues to fall quietly, doing its work without ceremony. Inside, warmth holds a little longer than expected. Bodies shift less. Breathing evens out across the room. You let yourself sink further, aware that this white covering above and around you is both burden and blessing. It demands labor later, but offers peace now. Frontier families lived with this trade-off constantly, accepting help where it came and preparing for the cost that followed. For this stretch of night, snow is kind. It presses gently against the cabin, asking nothing in return until morning. And wrapped in its muffled stillness, you rest more easily carried forward by the softest ally winter has to offer. As the night stretches on, something subtle happens to your sense of time. Without clocks that matter, minutes loosen their grip. Hours stop lining up neatly. Darkness does not feel like a single block anymore, but a series of long pauses stitched together by brief waking moments. A widely noted observation in winter frontier accounts is that people did not expect to sleep straight through the night. They expected to drift surface and settle again. You wake without alarm, no sound triggered it, no fear, just a gentle return to awareness as natural as breathing. This kind of waking was common enough to be unremarkable. People would open their eyes, assess the room, listen, adjust, and then let sleep reclaim them. Night was not something to conquer in one attempt. It was something you moved through gradually. You lie still and notice how darkness behaves inside the cabin. It is not uniform. Shadows gather differently near the walls. The hearth area holds a faint memory of light, even when no embers glow. Darkness here has texture. It feels layered, shaped by objects and bodies rather than empty. Many settlers described winter nights as longer than the clock would suggest. Scholars continue to debate whether this perception came from reduced daylight, colder temperatures, or the psychological effect of limited activity. Whatever the cause, the experience was consistent. Nights felt expansive, time slowed. You become aware of how people filled these waking pauses. Quiet conversation, if anyone was awake. Whispered words exchanged briefly, not to pass information, but to confirm presence. Sometimes prayer, sometimes simple thought, often nothing at all. Silence itself became an acceptable state, not something to escape. A quirky note from a frontier minister's journal mentions that people prayed differently. At night, shorter phrases, fewer words, as if conserving breath and intention together. Whether this reflected faith or fatigue is unclear, but the observation captures how nighttime shaped expression. You notice how your thoughts wander gently, not racing. There is no schedule pressing you forward. Morning will arrive when it arrives. This absence of urgency changes the mind's tone. Modern anxiety. Around sleep, the need to fall asleep quickly and stay asleep did not exist here. Waking was part of the pattern, not a failure. There is ongoing academic discussion about whether this segmented sleep improved mental health or simply reflected necessity. Some researchers argue that waking periods allowed for reflection and emotional processing. Others suggest it was merely a response to environmental interruptions. Frontier accounts, however, rarely frame these moments as distressing. They are described neutrally, even fondly. You hear someone else stir nearby, a small shift, a sigh. No one reacts strongly. Waking together was common. Falling asleep again together was easier than trying alone. Shared rhythm mattered. The cold plays a role here too. As temperatures dip further before dawn, the body responds by surfacing, slightly checking conditions. Too cold and sleep becomes shallow. Warm enough and it deepens again. This oscillation continues until morning light begins to soften the edges of night. You think about how this pattern shaped dreams. Many accounts describe dreams as vivid but fragmented, often tied closely to physical sensation. Cold winds, heavy blankets, firelight. The body and mind spoke to each other more directly here. Dreams did not escape the environment, they borrowed from it. A fringe anecdote from a Dakota Territory settler describes dreaming of stacking wood all night, only to wake feeling strangely prepared for the work ahead. Such stories blur the line between rest and rehearsal. Sleep did not remove people from their lives, it kept them within them. You notice how your own waking moment passes without frustration. You are not checking a clock. You are not calculating lost sleep. You simply observe, then adjust. A blanket edge pulled higher, a shoulder turned away from a draft, then stillness again. This acceptance was learned. People who resisted the night fought themselves as much as the cold. Those who adapted rested better, even if sleep came in pieces. This lesson appears repeatedly in letters and diaries often framed as advice to newcomers. There is disagreement among historians about whether such sleep patterns left people chronically tired. Some accounts mention exhaustion, others emphasize endurance. Likely both were true, depending on circumstance. What remains clear is that people normalize these rhythms rather than pathologizing them. You feel sleep return gently, Not like a switch, but like a tide. Awareness recedes without vanishing completely. The cabin continues its quiet work around you. Snow muffles sound, bodies hold warmth, time stretches without strain. This drifting in and out becomes the night's signature. Not a flaw, but a feature, a way of resting that matches the environment rather than opposing it. As you slip back under, you sense that morning is still far away, but not unreachable. The night has shape now, you know how to move through it. And with that knowledge, sleep comes again, steady and sufficient, carrying you onward toward the pale promise of dawn. When awareness returns again, it settles on what lies closest to reach: tools. Not in a dramatic sense, not weapons or implements of labour, but the small objects kept near in case warmth fails suddenly. A commonly observed feature in winter cabin life was that certain items always stayed within arm's length at night. Not because danger was expected, but because delay was costly when something did go wrong. You sensed them without looking. A spare blanket folded tight, a wool shawl draped over a chair back, a pair of mittens tucked beneath a pillow. These objects are positioned deliberately, memorized by touch. Darkness does not slow you when you know exactly where something is. People learned quickly that fumbling in the dark wasted heat and time. If the fire died too early or a draft opened, suddenly immediate response mattered. One frontier manual advised families to arrange nighttime essentials so they could be reached without sitting up fully. Whether this advice was widely followed is uncertain, but the principle appears repeatedly in personal accounts. You think about how these choices reflect expectation rather than fear. Keeping tools close did not mean assuming disaster. It meant accepting uncertainty. Winter nights were unpredictable. Preparedness reduced their power. There is an understated efficiency in the objects chosen. Nothing extraneous, everything multifunctional. A shawl could be insulation padding or draft blocker. A spare blanket could be layered, folded, or hung. Flexibility mattered more than specialization. A quirky detail from a homestead letter in the Adirondacks mentions a family keeping a candle stub within reach at night, not to light the room, but to check the firebox quickly if something seemed wrong. The candle was rarely used, but its presence was reassuring. Whether open flame at night was wise is debated, but the intention is clear. You feel the handle of a tool nearby smooth from years of use. Perhaps a poker, perhaps an axe handle, leaned just out of the way. Tools stayed close not for defense, but for control. Fire misbehaved, wood shifted, ice formed unexpectedly. Tools allowed correction. There is ongoing scholarly discussion about how much of this preparedness stemmed from prior trauma versus general caution. Some settlers arrived with stories of nights gone wrong. Others learned through close calls. Either way, habits formed quickly and persisted. You adjust slightly and brush against a folded garment. It shifts, but stays put. Someone arranged it carefully earlier. Night preparation often happened quietly without comment. These arrangements were part of the unspoken routine that framed rest. You become aware of how these objects anchor the mind. Knowing that help is within reach allows deeper sleep. Even if you never use them, their presence reduces tension. This psychological effect is noted in several frontier narratives, though rarely named explicitly. The fire's tools matter too. A small shovel, a piece of bark ready to catch a spark. These are placed with intention. If embers must be revived briefly before dawn, everything needed is already there. No searching, no wasted movement. You think about how this contrasts with modern dependence on systems that cannot be reached or fixed in the dark. Here, control is local. If something fails, you can touch it, adjust it. This closeness to systems fosters confidence. There is a fringe account from a Wyoming settlement describing a family who kept a flat stone near the bed to warm by the fire early in the evening, then move closer if the night grew too cold. The stone's weight and slow heat release made it useful long after the fire dimmed. Whether this was common or improvised is unclear, but it reflects creative adaptation. You notice how these tools are chosen for silence: metal that does not clatter easily, cloth that does not rustle loudly. Night adjustments are made quietly to avoid waking others and stirring air. Sound itself is managed as part of warmth conservation. Children learned where these items were kept without being told. They watched. They reached for them instinctively during cold spells. This knowledge transferred through observation rather than instruction. There is debate among historians about whether such constant readiness heightened anxiety. Yet many personal accounts suggest the opposite. Preparedness reduced fear. Knowing what to do mattered more than hoping nothing would happen. You feel the room settle again. Nothing needs adjusting now. The tools remain untouched. Their work is done simply by being there. Your breathing slows further. The mind releases some vigilance, trusting that if needed, action is possible. This trust allows rest to deepen. Outside, the cold remains indifferent. Inside, small, thoughtful choices continue to hold it at bay. The night moves forward, shaped by habits that make uncertainty manageable. You drift again, comforted not by luxury, but by readiness. And in this place, readiness is a form of rest. As the hours slide past, you notice how quiet becomes shared property. Silence here is not accidental. It is maintained. Movement is restrained. Speech is rationed. A commonly noted feature of winter nights in log cabins is that people developed unspoken rules about sound, especially after everyone had settled. Noise stirred air. Air stole warmth. Quiet was practical. You feel this rule operating now. Even when someone wakes, they do not speak immediately. Words require breath. Breath carries heat away. Instead, people listen first, assess. Only if something truly needs saying do they break the stillness. This economy of sound becomes second nature over time. You sense how this shared silence shapes behavior. Movements become smoother, slower. Nothing is abrupt. A blanket adjusted gradually rather than snapped into place. A shift of weight done carefully to avoid rustling cloth. These habits are not about politeness. They are about preserving the fragile equilibrium inside the room. There is a subtle social contract at work. Everyone understands that their comfort depends on everyone else's restraint. This understanding replaces explicit rules. No one announces it, no one enforces it openly. But the expectation is there, learned through cold consequences when it is ignored. A quirky anecdote from a frontier boarding house ledger mentions a traveller reprimanded not for rudeness, but for coughing loudly at night without covering his mouth. The complaint notes that his noise made the room feel colder. Whether this was literal or perceived, it reveals how deeply sound and warmth were linked in people's minds. You listen to the quiet and realize it is not empty, it is layered. The faint tick of wood contracting, the slow rhythm of breathing, an occasional soft sigh. Silence here contains life rather than absence. It holds information without overwhelming. There is academic discussion about whether such enforced quiet fostered stronger communal bonds or simply reflected necessity. Some argue that shared silence created intimacy without words. Others suggest it limited emotional expression. Frontier accounts do not resolve this question directly. They describe behavior more than feeling. You think about how modern environments treat silence differently. Today, quiet is often filled intentionally with noise. Here, silence is protected. It is allowed to exist because it serves a function. It conserves warmth and reduces fatigue. Someone stirs slightly, then stills. No one reacts. The system absorbs the movement. This tolerance exists because movements are small and expected. Large disruptions would prompt response, but minor ones pass without comment. You become aware of how this quiet shapes sleep depth. Loud environments demand constant vigilance. Here, the controlled silence allows the mind to relax without fully disengaging. Sleep is light but steady, layered like everything else. A fringe detail from a settler's letter in the Appalachian region describes how people spoke in whispers, even when awake at night, not out of secrecy but habit. Loud voices felt intrusive, almost disrespectful, to the effort everyone had made to maintain warmth. You feel your own voice disappear inward. Thoughts slow. Internal dialogue softens. There is less need to narrate experience when nothing demands response. This mental quiet parallels the physical quiet of the room. There is some disagreement among historians about whether this culture of quiet persisted outside winter months. Some suggest it relaxed during warmer seasons. Others note that habits formed in winter often lingered year-round. Silence became a marker of shared space. You think about how children learned this rule early. Loud play belonged to daylight, night belonged to restraint. Children who broke this rule learned quickly, not through punishment, but through discomfort. A kicked blanket or startled movement led to cold that everyone felt. Feedback was immediate and memorable. You hear a distant sound outside, perhaps wind shifting direction or snow settling. Inside, no one reacts. Experience has taught which sounds matter. This filtering allows quiet to remain intact. The shared silence also carries trust. You trust that if something important happens, someone will speak. Until then, quiet means stability. This trust allows deeper rest. You notice how time passes differently in silence. Without conversation or activity to mark it, the night feels smoother, less segmented. Waking moments blur into one another. The absence of sound stretches perception gently. You feel the room breathing as a whole, a collective rise and fall. This rhythm is soothing. It reminds you that you are not alone, even when nothing is said. Outside, the cold continues its patient work. Inside, silence answers, by holding warmth in place. The night progresses, supported by restraint, practiced quietly together. You let yourself sink further into this shared stillness. There is nothing to add, nothing to correct. The system is stable. Quiet does its work, and you rest within it, carried forward toward morning without a word spoken. As sleep loosens its grip again, your thoughts wander farther than the cabin walls, toward memories that did not originate here. Many of the people who built and slept in places like this carried habits from elsewhere. A widely observed reality of frontier settlement is that immigrants did not arrive empty-handed. They brought expectations shaped by colder valleys, milder coasts, stone houses, turf roofs, and winters that behaved differently. Night was where those expectations were tested most harshly. You imagine someone lying awake beside you, remembering a childhood room far away, a thicker wall, a heavier door, a different kind of cold. Those memories do not disappear when the environment changes. They surface at night when contrast is sharpest. People compared constantly, even if they rarely said it aloud. Some traditions translated well, others failed immediately. Stonehouse habits, for instance, did not always suit log cabins. In parts of Europe, thick masonry absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly at night. Here, wood behaved differently. It responded quickly to temperature shifts, offering little stored warmth. Once the fire died, immigrants learned this lesson through cold floors and restless sleep. A curious note from an early Scandinavian settler describes his surprise at how drafty log cabins felt compared to turf homes despite appearing solid. He wrote that the walls looked strong, but behaved like clothing rather than shelter needing constant adjustment. Whether this was common sentiment or personal frustration remains debated, but the observation captures the learning curve many faced. You sense how these imported habits slowly adapted. Bedding arrangements changed, fire management shifted, night routines evolved. People kept what worked and abandoned what did not, sometimes reluctantly. Tradition bowed to necessity without ceremony. Food customs changed too. Evening meals that suited milder winters proved inadequate here. Fats increased, portions adjusted, timing shifted. These changes often happened quietly within households, rather than through shared instruction. Night revealed failure quickly. Hunger and cold do not negotiate. There is ongoing scholarly disagreement about how quickly immigrants adapted their nighttime routines versus clinging to familiar patterns. Some evidence suggests rapid adjustment driven by necessity. Other accounts describe stubborn adherence leading to hardship. Likely both occurred, shaped by personality, resources, and luck. You think about language differences in the dark, whispered words in accents that sounded unfamiliar to the land itself. Night softened these differences. When everyone slept wrapped in wool breath, visible language mattered less than behavior. warmth equalized. A fringe anecdote from a frontier boarding house mentions how guests from different countries initially argued over window coverings at night, some preferring open air, others sealing everything tightly. The arguments faded after a few cold nights. Consensus arrived without debate. You feel how memory and adaptation coexist. People did not forget where they came from. They simply adjusted how those memories guided action. Night routines became hybrids, combining old knowledge with new observation. Over time, these hybrids hardened into local tradition. Children born here absorbed only the adapted version. For them, this cabin, this cold, this pattern of sleep felt normal. Immigrant parents noticed this difference. Some wrote about it with relief, others with quiet sadness. Their children belonged to this climate in ways they never fully would. There is academic discussion about how such environmental assimilation influenced identity. Did shared winter hardship accelerate cultural blending? Or did households maintain distinct practices behind closed doors? Nighttime routines suggest a mixture. Some habits persisted, others converged. You imagine small variations around the room. One family using feather bedding remembered from elsewhere, another relying solely on wool. One hanging quilts over doors, another stuffing cracks with straw, different solutions aiming at the same outcome. Warm enough to sleep. A lesser-known detail from a frontier census note describes inspectors observing wildly different interior arrangements in cabins that looked identical from the outside. Night practices were deeply personal, shaped by experience, more than instruction. You sense how this diversity existed quietly. No one advertised their methods. Success was measured privately. If your family slept through the night without illness, your system worked. If not, it changed. The cold did not care about origin stories. It responded only to effectiveness. This impartiality shaped adaptation faster than social pressure ever could. You feel your own body respond to this thought. Comfort here is conditional. It must be earned repeatedly. Habits must prove themselves nightly. Tradition without adaptation fails quickly. Outside, snow continues its quiet work. Inside the cabin holds multiple histories layered together. Each family that passed through left traces, adjustments, improvements, mistakes learned from and corrected. You drift again, comforted by the idea that survival here was not about abandoning the past, but refining it. Night after night, people learned what mattered, what could be let go, what needed to change. The rhythms of sleep continue. Waking, listening, settling. These rhythms feel older than any single culture. They belong to the place now. As your awareness fades once more, you recognize that the cold forged common ground among people who arrived different. In the dark, wrapped in the same materials, breathing the same air, differences softened. Practical needs took precedence. And so, as sleep returns, you rest within a tradition shaped by many hands, many memories, and many cold nights. The cabin does not care who built it. It responds only to how it is used. For now, it is used well, and that shared competence carries everyone gently toward the next waking, and eventually toward morning. When your awareness lifts again, it brushes against something quieter than habit, and older than memory. Knowledge borrowed rather than invented. Long before cabins rose here, people already knew how to live through nights like this. A firmly established truth in frontier history is that many settlers survived their first winters only by quietly adopting techniques learned from indigenous neighbours, even when they rarely acknowledged that debt openly. You feel this borrowed wisdom in the way the cabin is used, in how heat is conserved rather than chased, in how bodies are arranged to share warmth, in how attention shifts to wind rather than cold alone. These ideas did not emerge in isolation. They were observed, imitated, adjusted. Night was where their value became undeniable. You imagine early winters when newcomers struggled losing sleep, burning through wood too quickly, waking stiff and ill. Then slowly practices changed. Smaller fires, better ceiling, layered bedding, stillness. These shifts often followed observation of native homes nearby. Whether earth lodges, bark structures, or skin-covered dwellings, that behave very differently from European houses, but far better in extreme cold. A lesser discussed detail in settlement correspondence mentions how some families learned to bank snow deliberately against walls after seeing indigenous winter camps do the same. What initially looked careless or temporary revealed itself as effective. Snow was not just endured, it was used. You notice how this knowledge moved quietly, not through formal teaching, but through watching, through conversation that avoided credit, through copying what worked. Scholars continue to debate how widespread and explicit this exchange was, but the patterns suggest influence was significant even when unrecorded. You feel it in the rhythm of the night itself. Segmented sleep, waking, briefly, listening, adjusting. These patterns appear in indigenous winter practices described by early observers long before settlers adopted them. Night was not conquered by uninterrupted sleep, but navigated through cycles of awareness. A curious anecdote from a fur trader's journal describes his surprise at how calmly indigenous families slept through intense cold rising, occasionally to adjust coverings or stoke embers without agitation. He later admitted that his own sleep improved only after mimicking these behaviours, though he never framed it as learning at the time. You sense how materials mattered too. Fur hide thick woven fibres. Settlers initially relied on what they brought, then gradually incorporated local materials better suited to climate. Bedding changed, clothing changed, expectations changed. The night rewarded these adaptations quickly. There is scholarly disagreement about whether settlers fully understood the principles behind what they borrowed or simply replicated surface behaviours. Some argue that deeper understanding came later. Others suggest that effectiveness was enough. Knowing why mattered less than knowing when and how. You feel the presence of this layered knowledge now embedded in routine, the way drafts are blocked, the way bodies cluster, the way silence is used. These are not innovations of desperation. They are refinements learned over generations by people who had always lived with winter. Children born here absorbed these blended practices as normal. They did not distinguish between sources. They learned what worked. Over time, these methods became labelled as frontier ingenuity, even when their origins lay elsewhere. There is an ongoing debate among historians about how much of frontier survival culture should be credited to indigenous influence versus independent adaptation. The evidence suggests overlap rather than exclusivity. Settlers learned quickly when their own traditions failed. Indigenous practices offered tested alternatives. You think about how rarely this learning was acknowledged openly. Cultural tension, prejudice, and conflict complicated recognition. Yet necessity cut through those barriers at night. Cold demanded solutions, not ideology. You notice how this borrowed wisdom emphasizes cooperation with environment rather than dominance. Heat is conserved, wind is redirected, snow is used, the night is respected. These principles align closely with indigenous survival strategies documented across cold regions. You feel a quiet humility settle in. The cabin is not a triumph of one culture over another. It is a meeting place of knowledge shaped by need and experience. Outside, snow continues to insulate. Inside, bodies remain still. The night proceeds calmly. The system works because it draws from many sources. You drift again, comforted by the sense that survival here was not built from scratch, but assembled from observation, respect, and adaptation. Even when unspoken, that exchange mattered. As sleep deepens, the cabin holds not just warmth, but memory. Memory of people who understood winter long before logs were stacked and doors were hung. Their influence lingers in every quiet adjustment. And wrapped in that inherited wisdom, you rest more easily carried forward by knowledge that has already proven itself across countless cold nights. Eventually there comes a moment you've been half expecting all night. The fire gives up, not dramatically, no sudden dark, just a quiet acknowledgement that its work is done. The last ember dims, collapsing inward until even its faint red suggestion disappears. In many frontier households, this was not considered a failure, it was anticipated. A commonly recognized reality of winter cabin life is that fires were rarely kept burning continuously until morning. Fuel was too precious and sleep had to continue without it. You feel the change before you see it. The air cools more evenly now, no longer shaped by a single warm center. The cabin redistributes what heat remains. Blankets become more important. Bodies draw closer without instruction. The system shifts smoothly, as it has many times before. There is no scramble, no panic. People learned early that reacting too strongly to the fire's death wasted energy. Instead, they adjusted incrementally. A blanket edge tucked higher. A body rotated to block a draft. Breath slowed further. These small responses mattered more than rekindling flames in the middle of the night. You sense how silence deepens when the fire goes out. Its soft language is gone. What remains is the steady sound of breathing and the occasional creak of wood responding to colder air. This quieter phase of night was familiar. Some settlers even preferred it, finding the absence of firelight calming. A lesser-known detail from frontier correspondence describes families deliberately allowing the fire to die at a predictable time so the body could adjust gradually rather than suddenly. Whether this was common practice or individual preference is debated, but it reflects thoughtful observation of how heat loss affected comfort. You feel the cold begin to press closer, but not sharply. It arrives like a tide, not a wave. This gradualness matters. Sudden cold shocks the body. Slow cooling allows adaptation. People learn to let the fire fade rather than extinguishing it abruptly. There is scholarly discussion about whether letting fires die increased nighttime mortality during extreme cold. Some data suggests it did not significantly change outcomes when other measures were in place. Others argue continuous low fires offered better protection. What is clear is that families balanced risk against fuel availability constantly. You shift slightly, pressing your back against another body. Warmth transfers slowly. This shared heat becomes the primary defense now. Blankets seal in what remains. Clothing holds its contribution. The cabin walls, softened by snow, slow the loss further. Someone near you exhales deeply, settling into deeper sleep. The absence of flickering light allows darkness to become complete. This darkness feels different, more uniform, less active. Dreams change accordingly, less vivid, more drifting. A quirky anecdote from a prairie homestead mentions children being able to tell when the fire died by how dreams shifted, describing colder dreams or quieter ones. Whether this is literal or retrospective interpretation is unclear, but it speaks to how deeply fire shaped nighttime experience. You notice how your own awareness narrows slightly. Without the fire's presence, attention turns inward. The room feels smaller, more contained. This containment helps. Fewer variables, less to monitor. You think briefly about rekindling the fire before dawn. That decision will come later when cold reaches a certain threshold or morning work demands warmth. For now, it is not needed. The system holds. There is debate among historians about how often families rose to restart fires in the pre-dawn hours. Accounts vary widely. Some describe early rising as routine. Others suggest people waited until daylight. Likely the choice depended on fuel, weather, and household composition. You feel the cold settle into a stable state. Not comfortable, but manageable. This is the cold people slept through for months at a time. It shaped posture, breathing dreams. Outside, the night remains indifferent. Inside, adaptation continues quietly. The fire is gone, but its work lingers in the layers it helped prepare. You let yourself drift further now, trusting that this phase of the night will pass as it always does. The darkest hour is not an emergency. It is simply a stretch to be endured with patience. And as you settle into that patience wrapped in shared warmth and practice stillness, sleep carries you forward through the coldest part of the night toward whatever comes next. Sleep does not deepen in a straight line. It bends and loops, shaped by pressure and memory. As the fire's absence becomes fully accepted, dreams begin to change. They grow closer to the body, less visual, more physical. A widely observed pattern in frontier sleep descriptions is that dreams during extreme cold often mirrored sensation rather than story. Weight, stillness, breath, temperature. The mind stayed near the body because the body required attention. You drift through a half-sleep where thought and sensation blur. You're aware of blankets without seeing them. You feel the presence of others without identifying who they are. This state is neither fully awake nor fully asleep. It is functional. Many settlers described it as the most common winter sleep, though they lacked a word for it. You become aware of pressure points: shoulder, hip, knee. Staying in one position too long causes stiffness. Shifting too often opens drafts. The compromise is small, careful movement. You roll just enough to ease strain, then settle again. This choreography is learned. People who mastered it slept better and woke less sore. Dreams arrive in fragments. A memory of stacking wood, a sensation of walking through snow, a muffled sound like wind in trees that do not exist here. These fragments drift through without pulling you fully under. The cold keeps dreams close to the surface. There is ongoing scholarly discussion about whether such shallow dream states reduced psychological rest. Some researchers argue that deep REM sleep was harder to achieve in extreme conditions. Others suggest that lighter, more frequent dreaming served a different restorative function. Frontier accounts do not frame this as deprivation. They frame it as normal. You notice how dreams dissolve easily when awareness returns. There is no struggle to hold on to them. The body's needs take precedence. A draft touches your cheek. The dream releases you immediately. This responsiveness likely prevented deeper, cold exposure. A quirky detail from a frontier diary mentions a man dreaming of being wrapped in hides and waking warmer because he had unconsciously pulled his blanket higher during the dream. Whether the dream caused the action or the action shaped the dream is impossible to say, but the connection between mind and body is clear. You sense how hunger, if present, would intrude here. Dreams of food, waking to adjust. Tonight, nourishment holds. Dreams remain muted. Children dream differently. You hear a soft murmur. Not words, just sound. An adult nearby shifts, placing a hand gently on a small back. The sound fades. Dreams are guided back toward calm. There is debate among historians about how much of frontier dreaming was shaped by fear. Stories of danger exist, but they are less common than stories of labor, weather, and routine. The night was demanding, but not always frightening. Familiarity softened its edges. You feel the cabin itself participate in this dream state. Wood settles with slow, rhythmic creaks. These sounds weave into dreams rather than interrupt them. They become part of the mental landscape like waves in a coastal town. You drift again deeper this time. Awareness dims further. Muscles relax into the shape they have learned to hold all night. The cold is still present, but it no longer commands attention. There is a brief moment when you are not thinking about survival at all, not actively. The systems are in place. They hold. This trust allows rest that feels complete enough. Then awareness returns lightly once more. Not because something is wrong, but because dawn is approaching, even if you cannot see it yet. The body senses this before the eyes do. Temperature shifts subtly. Darkness changes texture. Dreams thin out. Sensation returns. You feel the weight of blankets again. The presence of others. The steady breath of the room. This cycling continues until sleep becomes more memory than experience. The night has done its work. Not perfectly, not luxuriously, but sufficiently. You remain wrapped in that sufficiency, drifting in and out without strain, as the long night edges toward its end. The cold has not defeated rest. It has shaped it. And within that shape you have slept as people did, here under pressure, within awareness, and still somehow at peace. As the night thins toward its final hours, a quiet understanding settles in. Morning is expected, but never assumed. On the frontier, this was not melodrama, it was arithmetic. A plainly acknowledged reality of 19th century winter life is that nights carried genuine statistical risk. People went to sleep knowing that cold, illness, or simple accident could change outcomes before daylight. You feel this awareness not as fear but as gravity. It gives weight to small sensations. A hand flexes, to be sure, fingers still respond. A breath is noticed, then released. These checks are subtle, almost subconscious, but they happen. Survival is monitored in increments. You listen for breathing again. Not because something sounds wrong, but because confirming that it sounds right matters. Slow, even, present. In many households, the earliest waking adult performed this mental inventory without naming it. Everyone accounted for, everyone still here. There are records of families discovering tragedy only at dawn, when movement began and someone did not respond. These accounts are sparse and understated, often mentioned briefly and without embellishment. The restraint in these descriptions has led scholars to debate whether such events were rarer than assumed or simply written about cautiously. Either way, the possibility shaped nighttime vigilance. You feel how the cold sharpens this awareness. Extreme conditions reduce margin for error. A slipped blanket, a misjudged fire, a delayed response to illness, none dramatic alone. Together they matter. This is why nights were treated with respect rather than bravado. A fringe anecdote from a northern settlement recounts a man waking repeatedly to check his own toes for numbness after losing a neighbour to frostbite complications during sleep the previous winter. Whether this story is typical or exceptional is unclear, but it illustrates how close experience informed habit. You sense how this awareness coexists with rest. People did not lie awake all night imagining worst outcomes. That would be unsustainable. Instead, they built systems robust enough that they could rest within risk rather than denying it. There is ongoing academic discussion about how this constant low-level threat influenced mental health. Some suggest it fostered resilience and acceptance. Others argue it created chronic stress. Frontier accounts themselves do not resolve this. They describe action more than feeling. You notice how the room remains still despite this awareness. No one panics. No one moves unnecessarily. The system has carried everyone this far. Trust grows from repetition. Night after night that ends without incident builds confidence. You think briefly about the language people used. They rarely said they survived the night. They said they passed it, endured it, came through it. These phrases reflect a relationship with time rather than battle. Night was something to move across, not defeat. You feel a slight change in air pressure. Dawn is not visible yet, but the night's deepest cold is easing. This easing is subtle. It does not announce itself. The body senses it before the mind does. Muscles relax a fraction more. There is a curious note in a frontier almanac observing that the coldest moment often came just before first light, not at midnight. People learned to expect this. It shaped when fires were relit and when people rose. Timing mattered. You hold still through this last stretch, conserving warmth. There is no advantage to moving now. The hardest part is almost over. Experience teaches patience. There is debate among historians about how often families truly feared not waking. Some argue the danger was overstated by later retellings. Others point to mortality data that suggests winter nights were genuinely perilous. The truth likely varied widely by region, resources, and luck. You sense a collective easing in the room. Breathing deepens. Someone stirs slightly, then stills again. The night has not taken anyone this time. This realization brings a quiet relief, not expressed, but felt. Another night accounted for. Another small success. These successes accumulated into survival. You let yourself sink back into rest lighter now. The risk remains until daylight, but it diminishes with each passing minute. The cabin holds, the systems hold. Soon someone will rise, wood will be added, light will return in pale increments, work will begin again. But for this moment, the night loosens its grip. You remain still aware that morning is coming, not because it is guaranteed, but because it usually does. That expectation, shaped by many nights like this, allows you to rest through the final stretch, calm and steady, carried forward toward the grey edge of dawn. By the time the night begins to loosen its hold, you notice a shift that has nothing to do with temperature. Something inside you has changed. Winter does that. Over weeks and months, it reshapes how people think, feel, and respond. A widely recognized observation in frontier writings is that long winters subtly altered temperament. People became slower, more deliberate, less reactive, not because they were defeated, but because patience conserved energy. You feel that patience now. Movements remain minimal even as awareness increases. There is no rush to greet the day. Morning will require effort, and effort must be rationed. This restraint is not laziness, it is seasonal intelligence. You think about how expectations changed once winter settled in. Summer promised progress, fields expanded, structures rose, winter narrowed focus, survival replaced ambition. This mental narrowing reduced stress in some ways. There were fewer choices to make, fewer plans to juggle. Night routines became predictable, even comforting. There is ongoing debate among historians about whether winter isolation caused emotional decline or fostered introspection. Some letters describe loneliness and melancholy, others describe clarity and calm. The difference often seems tied to preparation. Those who entered winter ready adapted better. Those caught short struggled more. You notice how humour changes in winter. Jokes become quieter, drier, laughter shorter. People conserve emotional energy the way they conserve heat. Yet humour does not disappear. It becomes subtler. A glance, a shared look, a small comment that acknowledges hardship without dramatizing it. A quirky detail from a frontier diary mentions a family developing a winter tradition of naming particularly cold nights after animals or tools, as if labeling them made them more manageable. Whether this helped morale or simply passed time is unclear, but it shows how people engage mentally with the season. You feel how this mental adjustment affects sleep. Anxiety lessens once expectations align with reality. You are no longer waiting for comfort, you are working within constraints. This acceptance allows deeper rest, even when conditions remain harsh. Children absorb this shift too. Their energy softens. Play becomes quieter. They learn when to move and when to wait. Winter teaches timing as much as endurance. There is scholarly disagreement about whether such seasonal mental shifts had long-term effects. Some argue they fostered resilience and self-reliance. Others suggest they limited expression and spontaneity. Frontier accounts rarely analyze the impact. They simply describe life as it was lived. You notice how conversation at night, when it happens, tends toward reflection rather than planning. People speak about what has already occurred rather than what might. Future plans are postponed until spring. This mental deferral reduces pressure. You sense how winter nights create a rhythm of containment. Physical space shrinks. Social circles tighten. Thoughts turn inward. This containment can feel oppressive or protective depending on perspective. A fringe anecdote from a mountain settlement describes a man who found winter nights soothing because they removed the burden of constant decision-making. He wrote that the cold made life simpler, if not easier. Such sentiments appear occasionally, offering a counterpoint to more common complaints. You feel the same simplification now. There is nothing to decide, nothing to adjust unless necessary. The night has done most of its work. Morning will bring its own demands. The body responds to this mental state. Muscles relax more fully. Breathing steadies. Even cold feels less intrusive when the mind is not resisting it. There is a quiet resilience in this adaptation, not loud determination, not dramatic grit, just the ability to continue functioning without constant strain. This resilience was built night by night through repetition rather than resolve. You think about how this shaped frontier communities. People who endured winters together developed shared expectations. Complaints were brief. Assistance was practical. Emotional expression adapted to circumstances. As dawn approaches, this mental steadiness remains. You are not eager. You are ready. There is a difference. Readiness is calm, eagerness is wasteful. You feel the night recede another step. The hardest part is behind you. Winter has taught you how to wait, how to endure, how to rest without comfort. And in that lesson, sleep lingers just a bit longer, deep and untroubled, carrying you toward the coming light, with a mind shaped by cold into something quieter, steadier, and prepared. Even before light appears, you become aware of others beyond these walls. Neighbours, not present, not visible, but accounted for. On the frontier, distance did not erase connection, it sharpened it. A widely acknowledged aspect of winter survival was that households relied on one another in ways that remained mostly invisible at night. You slept knowing who was close enough to matter and who was too far to reach before morning. You picture nearby cabins, their own small islands of warmth scattered across the dark landscape, each one managing its night quietly, much like this one. People rarely visited after sundown in winter unless something was wrong. Darkness and cold made travel dangerous. That danger, paradoxically, increased the value of proximity. A neighbour within shouting distance felt close. A neighbour a mile away might as well have been in another world. This awareness shaped how people slept. Knowing that help existed, even if unreachable at night, reduced fear. It framed risk. If something happened, daylight would bring options. That expectation allowed rest to continue through uncertainty. There is ongoing historical discussion about how often neighbours actually intervened during winter nights. Some records describe dramatic rescues through blizzards. Others suggest such events were rare and romanticised later. What remains consistent is that people thought about one another even while lying still in the dark. You sense how this awareness influenced preparation. Wood was shared earlier in the season, food traded, information exchanged. Nighttime survival depended on these daytime relationships. A cabin well stocked was not just self-sufficient, it was part of a network that had quietly agreed to endure together. A curious detail from a frontier account mentions families listening for distant sounds at night. Not because they expected visitors, but because hearing activity elsewhere reassured them that others were awake and well. Silence across the landscape could feel unsettling, suggesting isolation rather than peace. You think about how trust functioned here. Locks were simple. Doors were sturdy but not impenetrable. Security came less from barriers and more from familiarity. People recognized footsteps. They knew who belonged nearby. Nighttime intrusions were rare, and when they occurred, they stood out sharply against the norm. There is scholarly debate about whether this reliance on neighbours fostered stronger communities or masked vulnerabilities. Some argue mutual dependence built resilience. Others note that isolation still claimed lives when help could not arrive in time. Both can be true. You feel how this network extends into sleep itself. Knowing others share the same weather, the same risks, creates a sense of collective endurance. The night is not yours alone. It belongs to everyone, awake and asleep within reach of the cold. You imagine someone else miles away waking briefly, as you did earlier, listening, adjusting, then settling again. These parallel nights unfold without coordination, yet they are connected by experience. A fringe anecdote from a prairie settlement describes families agreeing to light lanterns at dawn during extreme cold spells, so neighbours could visually confirm survival from a distance. Whether this practice was widespread is unclear, but it illustrates how reassurance mattered. You feel a subtle comfort in this idea. Even when physically alone, you are not conceptually isolated. The frontier was sparse but not empty. People oriented themselves socially, even when apart. As dawn approaches, this awareness grows. Morning means movement, smoke rising from chimneys, doors opening, signs of life returning to the landscape. Night holds everyone separately. Morning reunites them symbolically. You remain still, letting this thought settle. Survival here was not solely individual. It was communal, stretched across distance and time. Sleep lingers a little longer, softened by the knowledge that others will wake too, facing the same cold, performing the same routines. This shared experience binds people without requiring words. And as the night fades further, you rest within that quiet network, supported not just by walls and blankets, but by the unspoken presence of others who endured the same darkness and would greet the same pale morning light. As the last hours of night pass, you realize that comfort has never truly been the goal. Survival here favors something else entirely: adaptability. A plainly recognized reality of frontier life is that people rarely waited for ideal solutions. They worked with what they had altered, it combined it and moved on. Improvisation was not a temporary phase. It was the permanent condition. You feel this mindset in the way everything around you has been arranged. Nothing is perfect. Everything is sufficient. Blankets do not match. Clothing is layered unevenly. Furniture sits where it blocks drafts rather than where it looks best. These choices reflect a worldview, shaped by necessity rather than preference. You think about how often repairs were made at night, not because people enjoyed it, but because night revealed problems that daylight hid. A draft only noticeable when the fire was gone. A seam that leaked cold only when wind shifted. These flaws were addressed with whatever was closest at hand. A folded coat, a sack of grain, a board wedged into place. A quirky observation from a frontier carpenter's notes mentions that many cabins were never truly finished. They evolved, each winter added adjustments, each night refined them. This ongoing modification meant that houses reflected lived experience rather than original plans. You sense how this attitude affected sleep. People did not wait for conditions to improve before resting. They rested within imperfection. This acceptance reduced frustration. Complaining did not warm the room. Acting did. There is ongoing scholarly debate about whether this constant improvisation fostered creativity or simply reflected hardship. Some historians argue that frontier ingenuity has been romanticized. Others point out that necessity genuinely drove innovation. The truth likely lies somewhere between admiration and realism. You notice how even small personal adjustments reflect this mindset. A scarf used as a pillow, a mitten repurposed as draft stopper. Nothing has a single purpose. Everything is flexible. This flexibility extends to expectations as well. You feel how this approach shapes resilience. When something fails, it is not a crisis. It is another condition to adapt to. This reduces panic. Panic wastes energy. Energy is warmth. Children grow up seeing this adaptability modeled constantly. They learn not to expect perfection. They learn to solve problems with what is available. These lessons embed deeply and surface later in unexpected ways. A fringe anecdote from a frontier schoolhouse describes children using spare clothing to seal classroom windows during winter lessons, copying habits learned at home. The teacher noted that the idea emerged without instruction. Adaptation was instinctive. You think about how modern discomfort often comes from mismatch between expectation and reality. Here, expectations align closely with conditions. This alignment reduces stress even when conditions are harsh. You feel a quiet pride in this competence even if it is not named. Survival becomes routine, not heroic, not dramatic, just continuous problem solving. As dawn approaches, the room feels slightly less cold, or perhaps you have adapted fully. It becomes difficult to separate improvement from acceptance. Both lead to comfort of a kind. You notice how people begin to stir more frequently, now not because it is warm, but because the body senses change. Morning work approaches, fires will be relit, movement will return, yet no one rushes. Improvisation extends into morning as well. Plans remain loose. Weather will decide much of what happens next. You remain still absorbing this final lesson of the night. That survival here did not depend on having the right tools or the perfect shelter. It depended on willingness to adjust, to combine, to make do. The cold has not been defeated. It has been accommodated. The cabin has not been perfected. It has been tuned. And in this tuning, repeated night after night, people found a way to live that did not require ideal conditions. Only attempting to patience, and patient adaptability. As sleep thins and awareness grows, you carry that understanding with you. The night has taught it quietly, through example rather than explanation. You rest a moment longer, knowing that whatever the morning brings you will meet it the same way this night was met. Not with expectation of comfort, but with readiness to adapt. As the edge of dawn approaches, your mind begins to sort memory from myth. Winter nights like this have been retold so many times that they sometimes blur into legend. Yet the reality was quieter, less dramatic, and far more repetitive than later stories suggest. A well-attested point in frontier scholarship is that daily survival rarely matched the heroic images that emerged afterward. It was not a constant struggle against nature, it was routine management of limits. You think about the stories that came later, tales of cabins glowing warmly in endless snow, families laughing beside roaring fires. These images linger because they're comforting. They suggest mastery. But first-hand accounts paint a different picture. Fires were controlled, not indulgent. Laughter was present but brief. Warmth was partial and temporary. This contrast has fueled long-standing debate among historians. Some argue that romantic portrayals emerged as a way to soften memory, turning hardship into identity. Others suggest that later generations misunderstood restraint as simplicity. The truth may be that both are true, layered, like the blankets you have been using all night. You sense how myth simplifies what reality complicates. It replaces countless small decisions with a single image. Yet survival depended precisely on those small decisions. Which blanket to use, how much wood to burn, when to move, when to stay still. None of these appear in paintings or songs. A quirky detail from an early 20th century interview with an elderly settler reveals his frustration with visitors who asked if winter nights were cozy. He replied that they were tolerable, which he considered a compliment. That word appears often in primary sources. Tolerable, endurable, manageable. You feel the truth of that now. This night has not been comfortable in a modern sense. It has been steady, predictable enough. That sufficiency rarely survives retelling because it lacks drama. There is scholarly disagreement about whether romantic imagery did harm by obscuring the dangers settlers faced. Some argue it minimized suffering. Others suggest it honored endurance by framing it positively. The accounts themselves often avoid emotional extremes, neither glorifying nor condemning the experience. You notice how reality resists simple moral framing. People suffered, people adapted, both can exist at once. The night does not demand interpretation, it simply unfolds. You think about how these myths influenced those who followed. Newcomers arrived with expectations shaped by stories rather than experience. Their first winter often corrected those expectations quickly. Letters home sometimes carry this adjustment, a softening of tone, a recalibration of language. A fringe anecdote from a frontier newspaper describes a man returning east after one winter, saying he learned more about patience in 3 months than in his previous 30 years. Whether this was exaggeration or insight is unclear, but it reflects how experience reshaped narrative. You feel your own understanding settle into something quieter. The night was not an ordeal to survive once, it was a condition to live within repeatedly. This distinction matters. Ordeals end, conditions persist. You sense how this reality shaped memory. People remembered winters not as singular events, but as seasons of nights like this strung together. The repetition blurred individual nights into a shared impression. As dawn approaches, the myth fades further. The cabin remains plain, the blankets remain mismatched, the cold remains present, yet nothing feels inadequate. The system worked. You realize that the power of these nights lies not in their extremity, but in their normalcy. Survival here did not rely on extraordinary acts. It relied on ordinary ones done consistently. This understanding feels grounding. It strips away exaggeration and leaves competence. That competence deserves recognition more than spectacle ever could. You let that thought settle as sleep thins further. The night has nearly passed, not conquered, not dramatized, simply endured, managed, lived through. And in that living through, the truth of frontier nights becomes clear. They were not stories waiting to be told. They were practices waiting to be repeated. As light prepares to enter the cabin, you rest in that clarity, free of myth, grounded in the quiet reality that carried people through winter, one unremarkable night at a time. With the night nearly spent, your thoughts turn not outward, but forward toward what this cold has been teaching all along. Not lessons written down or spoken aloud, but ones absorbed through repetition. Winter nights like this did more than test endurance, they trained it. A commonly accepted insight among social historians is that prolonged exposure to seasonal hardship reshaped behaviour in ways that lasted long after the cold loosened its grip. You feel those lessons settling quietly. Patience has become instinct. You no longer rush to correct discomfort immediately. You assess first. You wait a moment. Often, the body adjusts on its own. This restraint conserves energy. It also calms the mind. Winter taught people when not to act a skill as valuable as knowing when to move. You think about how this carried into daylight. Tasks were approached steadily rather than urgently. Tools were handled deliberately. Mistakes cost warmth, time, or strength. Precision mattered. That precision was practiced at night when consequences were immediate and unforgiving. There is ongoing debate among scholars about whether frontier winters fostered a distinct mindset or simply amplified traits people already had. Some argue the environment selected for adaptability. Others suggest it shaped everyone equally, regardless of disposition. The accounts suggest a mix. Some resisted the lessons longer than others, but winter eventually pressed its curriculum on everyone. You notice how cold sharpened attention to small details. A loose seam, a damp sock, a shifting wind. These details mattered enough to notice, but not enough to dramatize. This balance between awareness and calm is difficult to teach deliberately. Winter taught it naturally. A quirky note from a frontier merchant's journal describes customers becoming less impulsive during winter months, taking longer to decide and valuing durability over novelty. Whether this was a seasonal fluctuation or a learned behaviour is unclear, but the pattern appears often enough to suggest influence. You sense how nights like this also taught cooperation. No one slept entirely independently. Everyone's comfort depended on others' restraint and awareness. This interdependence carried into daily labour. Work was coordinated, resources shared. Individualism softened when survival required synchronization. There is scholarly discussion about whether such enforced cooperation strengthened community bonds or simply reflected necessity. Some letters describe deep trust, others mention resentment held quietly. Both likely existed side by side. Winter did not erase personality, it shaped how personality expressed itself. You feel how this night has trained acceptance without resignation. Acceptance does not mean liking conditions, it means understanding them well enough to operate within them. This distinction appears repeatedly in first-hand accounts, often without naming it directly. You think about how these lessons persisted even when people moved on. Many settlers who later lived in warmer homes retained habits learned in cabins, sleeping with extra blankets, keeping clothing nearby, valuing quiet at night. Winter had rewired their sense of comfort permanently. A fringe anecdote from an early 20th century memoir describes a man who slept better in cold rooms his entire life after surviving a brutal frontier, winter finding modern heated houses unsettlingly silent and still. Whether this was nostalgia or neurological adaptation is uncertain, but the sentiment is striking. You notice how your own body responds now. Cold no longer feels hostile, it feels familiar, manageable. This familiarity reduces fear and increases confidence. Fear consumes energy. Familiarity conserves it. There is disagreement among historians about whether this conditioning came at a cost. Some argue it normalized hardship unnecessarily. Others suggest it built resilience that served people well beyond winter. The records do not offer simple answers. They offer patterns. You sense that the most enduring lesson is proportionality. Problems are sized accurately. Small problems are addressed without panic. Large ones are approached patiently. This proportional thinking emerges naturally when resources are limited and consequences are clear. As dawn approaches, this mindset remains. You do not expect warmth immediately. You expect work, you expect gradual change. This expectation prevents disappointment. You think about how winter nights taught people to trust systems rather than moments. One warm hour meant little if the rest of the night failed. One cold spell did not define the season. What mattered was consistency over time. You feel gratitude again, not dramatic but steady. Gratitude for competence, for systems that work, for knowledge earned rather than assumed. The night has nearly released you now. Light will arrive soon, thin and pale, fires will be relit, movement will return. But the lessons of this darkness will not vanish with daylight. They will shape how wood is stacked, how food is eaten, how silence is valued, how discomfort is interpreted. Winter nights trained people to live with limits without being limited by them. You rest a moment longer, letting that understanding settle. The cold has not simply been endured, it has instructed. And as awareness sharpens toward morning, you carry those instructions forward, knowing they will surface again, the next night and the next, and long after winter itself has passed. The night finally loosens its grip, in a way you can feel rather than see. It is not light yet, not truly, but the darkness thins. The air changes texture. Cold remains, but it stops deepening. This shift is subtle, but people who lived through many winters learn to recognize it instantly. A plainly observed fact in frontier life is that bodies often sensed dawn before eyes ever confirmed it. You lie still through this transition. There is no rush to move. Moving too early wastes what warmth remains. Instead, you wait for the room to declare itself ready. Someone stirs nearby, not standing yet, just changing position. Another breath deepens. The cabin seems to inhale slowly, preparing. You notice how quiet at this hour feels different from the quiet earlier in the night. It is lighter somehow, less guarded. Even the sounds of wood settling feel less tense. The worst has passed. This knowledge settles through the room without words. People rarely marked this moment ceremonially. There was no celebration for surviving the night. Survival was assumed but never taken for granted. This understated relationship with danger is something historians still debate. Some argue it reflected emotional restraint. Others suggest it was simply practicality. Either way, the absence of drama shaped how mornings began. You feel the temptation to rise and resist it. The cold still holds power. Rising too early exposes skin stirs. Air breaks the fragile balance that carried everyone through the night. Experienced families waited until action had purpose. Someone eventually reaches for the fire tools. The movement is deliberate, quiet. A log is placed carefully. Kindling arranged, the first spark catches with a faint crackle that sounds almost loud after hours of stillness. Fire returns not as triumph, but as routine. The warmth arrives slowly. Knees first, hands next. You feel the ache of rewarming again, that sharp reminder of how cold the night truly was. Many frontier accounts mention this sensation as one of the least pleasant parts of morning. Cold could be endured, warming hurt. There is scholarly disagreement about whether people preferred to wake before dawn, to light fires, or waited for light. Evidence suggests both depending on labour demands and household size. What mattered was timing warmth with need. You finally sit up. Muscles protest briefly, then loosen. Blankets are folded or shaken, releasing air trapped overnight. The smell of wool and smoke rises again. Night gives way to morning without ceremony. You think about what this night represents. Not a story to be told once, but a pattern repeated countless times. Survival here was cumulative. One night meant little alone. Hundreds meant everything. As daylight begins to creep in, pale and cautious, you realize that the coldest nights did not define frontier families by suffering alone. They defined them by competence, by attention, by restraint, by systems refined through repetition. And now, as the room warms and movement returns, the night becomes memory. Not erased, just folded into routine. Tonight, it will happen again, and again, until winter loosens gradually, the way it always does. The fire settles into a steady rhythm now. The room fills with that low, dependable warmth that does not rush, does not boast. You feel your breathing slow again, not from sleep but from relief. The long vigilance of the night fades into something gentler. You let your shoulders drop. The weight of blankets lifts away. Muscles remember how to move without guarding every inch of skin. Light grows slowly, turning the cabin's edges soft and familiar. This is the moment to rest again, even briefly, to let the body register that it made it through. that systems held, that attention mattered. So stay still just a little longer. Let the warmth reach you fully. Let the sounds of morning remain distant. Let the night dissolve without hurry. You are safe enough now, warm enough, awake enough. And as the last traces of darkness retreat from the corners of the room, you carry with you the quiet knowledge of how people survived here. Not through force, but through understanding. Sleep can come again if it wants to, or you can simply rest in this soft, steady light. Either way, the night has passed. Sweet dreams.